saben lo que es un simposio, búsquenlo en la época griega. No va a llegar a tanto, pero más o menos. Es un poco nuestra contribución al aniversario, al 50 aniversario de la universidad, y en realidad es también agradecer a nuestros colaboradores con los que hemos establecido convenios, prácticas, experimentos de distintos tipos, y también para que se conozca a la comunidad nuestro trabajo, ¿no? Entonces, agradecemos a todos los miembros del Presidium. Nos acompañan el doctor Román Linares, el director de la División de Ciencias Básicas e Ingeniería, Division of the Basic Sciences and Engineering. El doctor Omar Lucio Cabrera, jefe del Departamento de Ingeniería Eléctrica. El doctor Juan Morales, jefe del Departamento de Física, y pues muchos otros de nuestros colaboradores. Entonces quisiera que nos hagas el favor de hacer la inauguración, por favor. Así. Sí. No.
Ok, muchas gracias al doctor Joaquín Aspiros, y bueno, hago rápido ahorita la inauguración, pero sí quería decir antes que la verdad me da mucho gusto este evento. Desde que soy director he tenido la oportunidad de convivir más con todo este grupo del CI3M, que antes solo los veía caminar por el pasillo, pero no tenía esta relación. Y la verdad es que lo que sí puedo decir es en estos poco más de 2 años que he estado conviviendo y que hemos estado al pendiente de diferentes situaciones, es que la verdad es un grupo que a mí me da mucho gusto que pertenezca a la división. Es un grupo muy activo, muy proactivo, organiza muchos eventos, eso es muy bueno, y pues lo hemos visto, ¿no? La semana pasada tuvimos, por ejemplo, la Expo Guami, y siempre mostramos el CI3M como una de las joyas de esta unidad. Y la gente que está trabajando aquí o relacionada con el centro siempre está muy dispuesta a ayudar, a contribuir a todas las actividades que se hacen desde la universidad, desde la división, y eso la verdad es de agradecerse. Y entonces yo sí, antes de hacer la inauguración, quiero agradecerle eso a todos los académicos relacionados con el centro, porque siempre están dispuestos a hacer cosas por la comunidad universitaria y también por la gente que viene de fuera. Entonces eso sí, reconocérselos, Joaquín, todo ese trabajo que han hecho, y espero que próximamente pues todo pueda marchar bien. Sabemos de los problemas financieros por los que está atravesando la universidad, el país, etcétera, y sabemos que pues los recursos son necesarios, sabemos de estas necesidades para la resonancia, etcétera, etcétera, y bueno, trataremos de seguir apoyando desde nuestra trinchera para que todo vaya funcionando lo mejor posible. No sé si antes de inaugurar quieres que diga algo, Omar, y ya después inauguro. Omar, porque si no…
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Pues reiterando lo que dice el doctor Linares, pues se agradece mucho la participación en este tipo de actividades de los colegas que integran el CI3M, y pues sí es un orgullo para la unidad el tener este laboratorio, este centro de investigación. Y bueno, pues felicidades y muchísimo éxito en este simposio. Gracias.
Yo nada más quisiera agradecer a los principales organizadores, que es el doctor Morales, Rafael Lara, Fabiola Martínez, que son los que trabajaron para que se pudiera hacer mucho de esto. ¿Sí? Gracias.
Ok, bueno, entonces creo que estamos hoy… va a haber algo. Siempre déjenme contar una anécdota. Siempre cuando iba a los seminarios aquí del doctor Olayo y de su grupo, ¿no? De que agarraban a las pobres ratitas y les pegaban un balinazo y las lesionaban. Yo decía, qué salvajes, ¿no? Creo que eso es lo más cercano que yo puedo hacer a eso, con unas tijeras y cortando el listón. Y bueno, entonces, siendo el 12 de noviembre, a ver, nos paramos y todo, hoy somos muy formales. Siendo el 12 de noviembre de 2024 y estando todos aquí. Hemos inaugurado este simposio a la griega, como nos decía Joaquín, y pues que sea un simposio de mucho éxito, estamos seguros que así va a ser, de mucho aprendizaje y sobre todo todos los jóvenes que veo por aquí, que aprendan mucho y que disfruten mucho este evento y enhorabuena para todos los organizadores y para todos. Y vamos a cortar, eso es la primera vez que lo hago. Fotos, por favor, muchachos. Creo que no tiene filo. Okay, no, la atención fue. ¿Algo más, Joaquín?
Voy a presentar. So now we have
Un coffee break mientras está a las 11.
coffee break and then we'll have the sponsors.
Okay. Para que aprovechen que están.
And we apologize to speak in Spanish, but it's more funny when we make jokes in Spanish. Okay, thank you.
Hola, buenos días otra vez. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Les recuerdo, este es un simposium, es nuestra manera de celebrar los 50 años de la universidad, invitando y teniendo ponencias con muchos de nuestros colaboradores externos e internos. Y hoy tenemos en particular el agrado de presentarles al profesor Ratko Majarevich, que es un profesor que hizo su doctorado en Ingeniería Eléctrica en 1994 en la Facultad de Ingeniería Eléctrica de la Universidad de Zagreb. Es el presidente de la Federación Internacional de Ingeniería Médica y Biológica, entonces nos viene así como invitado súper especial. Y pronto se incorporó el Grupo de Ingeniería de Electrónica y Medición de la Facultad de Ingeniería de Zagreb. Es profesor titular e imparte varios cursos de instrumentación electrónica, ingeniería biomédica, y eso es lo que hizo en sus estudios de licenciatura y posgrado. Su interés científico y profesional se centra en los campos de instrumentación electrónica y biomédica y la informática sanitaria, en particular en el análisis de los potenciales cardíacos y la estimulación cardíaca en la investigación de nuevos métodos de administración de fármacos basados en la electropermeabilización y recientemente en la investigación de sistemas móviles de salud inteligentes personalizados. Es autor o coautor de numerosos artículos en revistas y congresos, varios libros de texto y capítulos de libro. Entonces, los dejo con el profesor Ratko Majarevich.
Hola, mi nombre es Ratko Majarevich y soy un maestro de la Universidad de Zagreb. Yo no hablo español, me comprendo un poco. So I will switch to English now so that it's easier for you and for me. I'm very glad to be here at the University, Autonomous Metropolitan University in Mexico City, and we just talked about when I was here last time, so it was 16 years ago, so the time passes much faster than we would like to do that. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you, and if I manage, I'm managing the screen, so after this small introduction, I will show you a few slides on the University of Zagreb. And then I will speak a little bit about the International Federation of Medical and Biological Engineering. And then I will switch a little bit to these technological issues that are present today in, let's say, biomedical engineering, but not only from some technical aspects, because when you speak about, let's say, artificial intelligence in healthcare, then that is at least one course, if not more. So I will just touch some more societal and policy issues with the new technologies. And then just that I don't leave everything so dry, and at the policy level, I will show you a few slides on the research that my PhD students are doing in Zagreb at this moment. So these are the slides on my university. The University of Zagreb was celebrating 360 years of existence a few years ago. Of course, the Faculty of Electrical Engineering and Computing, where I'm working, is not that old, so it became an institution which was completely independent only about 65 years ago. And my faculty is one of the organizations that has most of the European Union projects. That means that we are quite involved in the research in European Union. So though Croatia is a very small country, and though that at the time when these people who are mentioned in this slide have been living, the states in Europe have not been defined as today, and most of these gentlemen actually went from Croatia and served either in Rome to the Pope or in Venice, and also some other countries. So from those who are mentioned here, perhaps you will know Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was born in Croatia, and he also left relatively early to the United States, where he invented the alternating current, the asynchronous machine, a lot of types of capacitors and so on, a lot of in radio frequency transfer and so on. So perhaps you even didn't know that Tesla was a person, and most of the students, like 20 years ago, when you ask them who is Tesla or what is Tesla, they said, oh yes, that's a measurement unit for magnetic flux. Now when I ask that the youngest generation of my students, they say, oh yes, that's the car, because there is the electrical car Tesla. So this is a little bit of a joke, but anyway, I will switch to the other slide because of the restrictions in the time. And these are the data that are showing some of the investments that are coming from abroad, either through scientific projects or through the other means. So you can see here that we have now the first in the world product over the electrical supercar in the world, which is boosting the economy in Croatia very much. You see, what we are trying to achieve is to develop as many innovations as possible. So in support to these activities, we have now an institute. This institute is named after Nikola Tesla, so it's so-called Nikola Tesla Innovation Center, which then take over from us researchers to actually industrialize these products, because that's a lot of knowledge and training you have to have in order to come from some idea in biomedical engineering to a product that you can really implement in clinical practice and then of course sell, because if you don't sell it, you have no money to invest into new products. As you can see, this is the name when our university was founded. It's 1669. And Croatia is a small country, so Zagreb is the capital, so it is to be expected that it is the largest university, and there are some of the data about the students. My faculty is organized in 12 departments, and one of the let's say interdisciplinary study programs that are also positioned and that are running at my university is the biomedical engineering. We were celebrating in 2021 the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the laboratory for biomedical electronics. That was the name at the time when it was established. We are trying to develop good quality study programs for our students, and also to make it possible for them to be active also in the other fields like sports, music, also in politics and so on. We have some of the professors who are also top, let's say, in publications in the world. And the picture you can see here is the picture of the buildings, but it's probably, let me see, oh no, it's this here. Yeah, you can't point anything on the screen. So we have 4 buildings. I'm in this building that is closest to this relatively large street. Currently, the skyscraper you can see is under construction or under reconstruction, because we had this earthquake 8.5 Richter, and a lot of buildings had been damaged. So we have to actually rebuild this skyscraper. And I heard that you had also a large earthquake in 2017, so you can imagine what kind of damage is then to be repaired. And actually that is all about my university. I just want to mention that in Europe we have very, very large program Erasmus Plus that is enabling the exchange of students. I am promoting that a lot, and I already had some of the students from Latin America, from Colombia, I had also as guests on my department teachers from Venezuela, Colombia, and I think Chile, so that we know that it's possible. If anybody of you would like to come to Croatia, there are 28 other European countries that are covered by Erasmus+, but we are also open to take the students, as I said, if you would like to come to visit Croatia and my faculty. Now I will be talking about the International Federation for Medical and Biological Engineering. So what we are a so-called learned society. What does that mean? That means that our primary interest is in research, development, innovation, but also education and training. And what we are trying to do is to build a kind of a network, so that the ideas faster go from one researcher to the other, because today it's practically impossible to have a really serious project in healthcare or in medicine without help of other institutions. Firstly, because the instrumentation that is used in the research is very complex and very expensive. When I say complex, that means that you actually have to have an operator who is at least an engineer who knows how to push the buttons and which software to use and how to use a particular software in order to achieve the results that we would like to have. So we are a federation of the societies. If you want to become a member of IFMB, you have to become a member of SOMIB, that is the Mexican Biomedical Engineering Society. So you don't have to pay anything extra for being a member of IFMB, because the relations we have with our member societies. So we don't see you as individuals, we see the representative of SOMIB, and whatever the communication is goes through this representative. So we have a lot of different goals, but I think the main goal, our main goal is that we stay the leading organization in biomedical engineering in the world, and that we build this large international network of biomedical engineers that then is in support and is an enabling factor for research, development, and innovation. All the countries that are in different colors are the members of IFMB. That means the biomedical engineering societies from these countries are the members. As you can see, all the developed countries practically are members of the IFMB, so we are now gaining new members in Africa and in different parts of Middle East where we are not represented well. This is a map of the international liaisons of the IFMB. Why do you need these international liaisons? Why do we have, let's say, to combine into the organization called the International Union for Physical and Engineering Sciences in Medicine? Why don't we go to the higher levels of organization alone? Because no matter how we think that we are important in healthcare, the number of engineers as compared to the medical doctors is much, much lower per capita, per patient, or whatsoever. So in order to raise our voice, we are also engaged with the medical physicists into this umbrella organization. Why do we need this umbrella organization? Where do we want to be present? We want to be present in this International Science Council. Well, why do we want to do that? Don't we have enough work to do on our own and for our own? Well, actually, you see, this International Science Council is an organization where representatives of different professional unions are meeting. And these people who are there are very experienced, and they look into the far future. That means, let's say, if you take a minister of science or a dean or a rector, they usually have a limited term of office, and then somebody else comes with some other ideas. And it's sometimes very difficult to make plans for the so-called far future. What is the far future? The far future was 20 years ago when some of the people from these organizations said, have a look, all the data shows that there will be global warming, that the water level will rise. What are we going to do with that? And then, you know, when you have such a global group of people who really are experts and so on, then you go to the governments, then you go to the organizations like UNESCO, like the United Nations, in the matters of health, to the World Health Organization. So these people look, as I said, 10, 20, 30 years ahead, what might happen. We never know what's going to happen. But these are the data that are based on science, and based on science, we know that we can make some models that will predict what's going to happen in far and in near future. Then I will just mention the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, which is another higher level organization, but here mainly our engineering organizations are gathered. I will come with another slide a little bit later, and I will just mention in this place now the WHO, or the World Health Organization, because we are dealing with medicine and healthcare, so they are the most intensive parties on the international scene that we. In this scheme where we have the WHO, I think it's important to say that we have a lot of different kind of projects with the WHO, and the engineering aspect of our engagement is also in standardization. So as engineers, you know that if you want to make a good product, this has to be in alliance with different standards, usually not only one, but there is safety standards, there are standards that are following the production, and so on and so on. So this is all what students actually should learn in order to be successful entrepreneurs and to be able to work in different kind of positions in the engineering and industrial processes. What is the result of our collaboration? Well, one of the results that we had like 10 years ago, no, in 2017, is this survey of human resources for medical devices, the role of biomedical engineers. The reason why we, together with the WHO, which is very supporting for our profession, they do understand that without technology in medicine and healthcare, there is no real step forward. We collected the numbers and the positions of different biomedical engineers worldwide. And then when we had this, let's say, proof, we went to the International Labour Organization and got a code for the profession of biomedical engineering among the engineering and also among the healthcare workers. So again, getting a code, why do you need a code? Why is it for you important that there is a code in the codes of the professions? Because let's say the biomedical engineering is now a recognized profession. So when you have a diploma in biomedical engineering and you go, let's say, to Europe and want to find a job there, they know who you are. They know that there is some documentation that is an existing profession, and so on and so on. And also it's much easier for biomedical engineers who are working in clinical environment, like the clinical engineers, that they also recognized as healthcare workers, because that means they have a much higher impact when they have to say something about the new diagnostic, therapeutic procedures, and so on. Then again, when we speak about the projects with WHO, there are for different diseases the list of priority medical devices. This slide is taken from the cancer management. So you see, the WHO, we must be honest, is oriented mainly on the middle and low income countries in helping them. And then there are a lot of programs that are helping them by different kind of grants and so on. So what is appropriate to be, let's say, granted or given to a particular hospital or a clinical unit, let's say in Africa. So I will explain that to you on, let's say, one or two examples. One example is that for an African country, one organization decided to give a gift of 20 incubators for the kids. So in the incubators, you may know, you control, let's say, temperature, and you control also oxygen. So these incubators came to the hospital. You know how long they worked? How long they were in operation? Exactly 6 months. Why? Because the sensors for oxygen get dirty after 6 months. Sometimes they work 8-10 months, okay, but the producer does not want to take any responsibility if the measurement sensor is not working okay and so on. So electronically, after 6 months, they switch off. So 20 incubators, 20,000 euro each, stopped working because the particular hospital did not have 20 times 2,000 euro to buy new sensors. Therefore, you have to also to make sure that the care that you are planning to do through these grants or any other way is sustainable. Otherwise, you just spend money and there is no real contribution to the healthcare in such countries. And then the third document is without any color, is also the most boring one. It is the resolution of the World Health Assembly. So the IFMB is a non-governmental organization affiliated to the WHO, and we may propose these resolutions. They are actually relatively weak documents. You know, they cannot say like you must do something in a very short period of time, but they introduced some, let's say, terminology into the health policy of the countries, like introducing health technology assessment or health technology generally. Why do we need that? Because the signees of these documents are the ministers of health. And then that means that these resolutions have to be implemented in the particular countries in 3, 5, or 10 years. And it's also strengthening the position of biomedical engineers on the world scene. Of course, it is not because of us. It is because we really want to make the health care through our products and our development, research, and everything else stronger and better than it is at this moment. With the World Federation of Engineering Organization, we are involved in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, just the one that we are following is good health and well-being. What is now the reason why we are in this organization? Why cannot we do that, what we want to do alone? Because at some moments when there are, let's say, large disasters, like the bank holiday tsunami a few years ago, about 10 years ago, actually, let's say, the main reason of the deaths after the tsunami was the lack of purified water. It's not that the MRIs were not working. It was something that's much less complicated. From the point of view of healthcare, and what was recognized as an issue at those times was connectivity. That means how do you transfer the information on the health and so on and so on. So there is a lot of things that are already written about that. Thank you. So what we are also trying to make for our members is to announce the events. You can see now the news page of the IFMB, where we announce the events that are happening, where we are announcing the new issues of our journal, Medical and Biological Engineering and Computing. We are present at Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We are trying to make it worth for the youngest generations of biomedical engineers, and that means the students in the field of biomedical engineering, their engagement. So we introduced several awards. One of them is Young Investigator Award. So if you are present at any of the conferences of the IFMB, you may compete for the best paper or best poster. Then we are organizing scientific challenges. This is aimed for the students in computing or close to computing. There is a data set usually, and then there is a request to investigate or develop something with this data set, and then the jury is then checking how well the algorithms or whatever you have proposed are working. And the student design competition is the more hardware and embedded software oriented competition, where also the judges then judge what are the best solutions. There for the students, there is a group that is working with the students, or better to say students are working with the professors. It's called Student and Recent Graduates Working Group. So at the different events, the students organize panels and meetings of the students, and also they are very active in the organization of summer schools. So one of the summer schools that will have the 10th edition this year in Latin America is the Bogota Summer School on the technologies aimed for the support of elderly persons. And of course, we have some larger events like the World Congress. The World Congress is, so to say, jumping from one continent to the other every 3 years. The next one is going to be in Australia. So I must be realistic and think that not many of you will be able to come, if any. But then I was told that I may tell you the news. Do you know where is the World Congress 2028 going to be organized? Anybody? The teachers? Do the teachers know? Yeah, it's going to be most probably in Monterrey, in Mexico. So then I hope, if not earlier, to see you there, because that's not so far away. And I hope that at least some of you will stay in touch with the new technologies that are developed, that you will find your jobs in biomedical engineering, either in the academia or in the industry, which is also very worth, and also in the agencies. So please come. Yeah. Okay, so, well, just a few concluding remarks on this session on the IFMB and on the international engagements of the IFMB. We are the strongest organization as the organization of the associations in biomedical engineering, and we are building very, very strong international network. So that is a reason for you to join, because you can learn not only from your textbooks here. Does anybody use textbooks anymore, or just the internet? Who is using books? Oh, fine, about 10%. That's not so bad. Okay. So we need you all. I don't know. It's not very probable that each and every of you will be engaged in the IFMB, but all of us are volunteers. Professora Fabiola Martinez is one of these volunteers. I'm also the volunteer. And, it's very important that we have enough people who are knowledgeable and willing to help in organizing all these activities. So if you can spare a few hours a month in helping in organizing something, spreading the news, and so on, we will be very happy to accept you as partners in this organization. So herewith I will stop this part, and now I will switch to the key technologies. Of course, today one of the main buzzwords is digital health. So was the health up to now analog only? No, of course it's not. But what has changed now recently is actually that the computers became so powerful that they can handle a lot of data in real time. And this ability to handle a lot of data, that means a lot of different kind of data, not only that you have a lot of data on one particular physical quantity that you are measuring, but that you actually can combine all this data into searching for the best possible result, which will be probably early diagnosis and an accurate diagnosis. And of course, in the world that is then mainly today transferred from medical imaging to different kind of therapies, also to be able to make the best choices for a particular patient. So the basis for using, for appropriate using of this big data analytics, and then also machine learning and artificial intelligence is actually that you have all this data in one reservoir, in one memory somewhere in the cloud. So it's very important to base the information about the patients and also about the healthy persons in something that we usually call today electronic health record, and that this electronic health record is reachable everywhere where it is needed, and that it can be then used for making proper decisions from the health of the medical staff. As you may know, currently, mainly the methods in machine learning are divided into supervised and non-supervised methods. So most of the supervised methods use some kind of linear models. That's easy for us to understand. If you have, let's say, 1 kilo and you double it, it's 2 kilo, it's obvious. But in the unsupervised methods, very often non-linear methods are used. And then, you know, this is now a little bit more shaky and so on. So the medical staff at this moment is not very keen to accept such methods. So that one of the big issues in the biomedical engineering, let's say research and so on, is the explainability of the models that are being used for decision making or making any other of the decisions that are made in the healthcare. So in these slides here, I have listed some of the issues that are present with the healthcare data. I see Dana, data actually should be here. So data, when we speak about the data, it is also very important to understand that if you want to have good results, you have to have good data. And that means that the data have to be accurate and timely. I think with timely, we mainly can make it. As soon as the data enters some kind of a network, wireless, optical, electrical, whatsoever, you have it wherever you want to have it in the world. But with the data input, that is really a problem. Because if the data is not accurate, you cannot make accurate decisions. The other aspect of this having accurate or not accurate data is also missing data. You see, the data like medical images, they are actually static, even if you are imaging the heartbeats and so on, but this is a set of data. You are never attached to some medical imaging device for 24 hours a day. But today we would like to make the risk of any non-wanted event with people who are active in their life, who are walking. Many of them are elderly persons who are sometimes prone to get a heart attack or a stroke or something like that at any moment in the day. And of course, you probably know that the probability of survival after, let's say, a stroke or heart attack is very, very much in correlation with the time when you have some kind of a treatment of such a person. So that's excellent, But with 7 hours, for 24 hours, 7 monitoring of the persons, you must have missing data. What is now happening in these gaps when you don't have the data? What kind of decisions you can make? So these are all the issues that we still have to solve. The important thing for you as the engineers, when you will be planning some input of the data, you have to be aware that those data that are being measured are accurate. That's our responsibility. And then, of course, with good data, we can make some progress in the disease, in handling of the diseases. So, therefore, we, as the IFMB, have founded a new division, which is called Digital Health Division. So, this Digital Health Division has different kind of tasks, and you can see them listed here. These tasks are also listed at the website of the federation. So, I will not go through each and every of these in interest of time. This is a list also of some of the innovations that are very much in at these days. Also, the World Health Organization is boosting the implementation of the innovation in healthcare. Though you must know the World Health Organization is very, very conservative. You really have to have all these CE marks and FDA allowance and so on for the devices if you want to implement it in the hospitals on people. But once they are allowed to be present, then the WHO is very keen to use the new things. So there are a few slides more on the artificial intelligence. These issues on handling the data, that means data analytics, artificial intelligence, is now in the top interest of WHO. So this year we had the consultations close to the World Health Organization, the Patient Safety Day, where the World Health Organization, with help of the experts, that means also by medical engineers and economists and medical doctors, nurses, patients, and so on, is trying to formulate a policy that would be implemented worldwide in terms of keeping the patient safety high. You know that in order to put a device to the market, you have to obey certain rules. So these rules are in Europe expressed by the CE mark, which then categorizes the devices into 4 groups. And the important thing for the European economy is a large number of innovation in medical technology. So you can see on this slide that for more than 10 years, medical technology was the second most active in the number of patents that are implemented to the European Patent Office. That means that there is still something to improve, something that we can make better. The problem with healthcare is that the health expenditure in percentages of the GDP of the countries is rising. So you can see here a span of several decades. And this is especially the problem for the less developed countries. That is the lower part of this slide, where you can see the expenditure for health in different countries. So you see that most of the blue dots are on the left-hand side. That means very low expenditure. But when you look at the developed countries, that means, let's say, Europe, you can compare the red and the green columns. So the red columns are the growth of the GDP, and the green one are the growth of the healthcare expenditures in percentages. So from all these developed countries, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Spain, and so on, in that year particularly, only Ireland had a higher growth of the GDP as compared to the healthcare expenditures. That is the point where also you, as the young engineers who will be developing new devices, new protocols, new softwares for healthcare, have to be thinking. You may have a very ingenious invention. If it is too expensive, it will never come to the market, it will never come to the clinic. So you have to think also on simplicity of your products in order to make them worthwhile, because otherwise, as I said, they will end up in some kind of a cupboard in some of the institutions. Okay, as this example of what is the development of the technology, biomedical engineering is relatively new. We must say that it started developing really after 1947 when the silicon transistor was developed. Then everything could be made small and portable and so on and so on. So in these 50 years, let's take an example of the medical devices that are used for monitoring of the glucose in the blood. From the 70s, when these electronic devices started being present on the market, up to now, we have several generations of these devices. And some of them were very clumsy at the beginning, and then the second generation was the classical glucometers, which mainly the patients of type 2 are using. Of course, at that time, in this time span, for several decades, it were used also by diabetics type 1. And then the next step was that in the third generation, it's possible now to have the so-called CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, but some small sensors that are readable, and very often they are also connected with the insulin pump, so that we started talking about the artificial pancreas, because the loop is kind of closed, and there are some interventions still needed. But you see, up to now, there is no glucose measurement that is present on the market without being invasive. Invasive, that means that now for measuring of the concentration of the glucose, you have to make an incision through the skin. So the holy grail of the diabetology is to the fourth generation, which would be non-invasive. And are we successful in this? Yes. We made a lot of nice devices like this lens. They're called Google Lens because Google invested into them, and you see, you just put the lens, you have all the necessary technology on the measurement device, analog to digital conversion, the transmitter, and so on. So why don't we have it on the market? Because it's too much dependent on the environment. So if you have dry weather, if you have windy weather, your eyes will be dry and they will not produce tears. If you go to the theater and there is some very touchy scene, you start crying, you have too much water. So unfortunately, it was not sustainable, no matter how ingenious from the engineering point of view it is. So now there perhaps might be some solution in these patches that are tattoo-like. So it's perhaps even from the point of view of wearability interesting for young people, because I see that everywhere in the world young people have the tattoos everywhere. So this might be only temporary, but these dots, blue and yellow, you see, are actually sensors for different kind of the liquids that we have in the body. So of course it's not yet a finished project, so we will hear about it in the coming years. So this is the part that I actually wanted to show you. As you see, it's an unfinished story. There is something where you can contribute to glucose measurement and to many, many other fields where we came to a certain level of support to the patients and to the medical doctors, but it's not a finished story. So let me see, what do I have here? No, I'm sorry for this. I was not aware. I was changing the position of some slides, so I have to go to that part where I wanted actually to show you some of the things that my PhD students are engaged now. Okay, this is, the general idea was that I show you this slide before showing the slides on glycemia. You see, one of the difficult issues with medical devices is that they have a much longer time to market than the other ones, because they deal directly with people. And the average time for the machines like MRI, CT, defibrillators, and other ones that are in this highest risk category of the medical devices is like 14 years. That's some average time, blah, blah, but it's a long time. So the only thing in the terms of the implementation of medical devices that was good from COVID was that the agencies in Europe and in the USA agreed to make these procedures shorter, so that it now to get a medical device to the market is much shorter. How much? It depends on the complexity of the device. Now we have to skip again the same slides, and now we came to the research in my group. So how much time do I have?
15 minutes.
Oh, still 15. Okay, so I'll try to give you at least a 5 minutes break before the next presentation. So the slides and the part of the investigation that I will show you is a result of our involvement in the research of the technological support for elderly people. That's something that we started between 20 to 25 years ago, when our government and European societies started being aware that more and more people are getting older, and this is the standard presentation of life expectancy. So you can see in both of these slides that in these pyramids the number of elderly people is growing, and this is a span from 0 to 100 years, and you can see that the maximum is now somewhere very, very close to 90 years, while let's say these days the men are relatively low, about 60%, women probably about 70 years old, and it will obviously change in the forthcoming years. So the idea is, of course, to implement some of the emerging technologies. Emerging, that actually means new technologies and promising technologies. And you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide, sorry, it's your left, yeah, it's your left-hand side, that there is a list of these technologies. So we were using the wearable technologies. We developed some of those smart algorithms. We are using now these tools that are considered to be artificial intelligence to squeeze out some of the features that we need for decision making from this set of input data that we get from different kind of sensors. So it's of course always a question what everything you have to fulfill to be successful. So one of the things is the minimal disruption for the user. That means that you don't feel actually that you're feeling this sensor. So all those sensors that are implemented and that are integrated into the mobile phones, they are perfect. The only thing is that you don't carry your mobile phone everywhere. That means that 724 issue of monitoring cannot be, let's say, fulfilled, and for some of the patients it may be the critical. Proven utility, that means that you are really sure that you know what you are doing, that you will be using in the right way the data you get. Then the issue of costs, we already touched about that. Then also the possibility to integrate it into the electronic health record. So because you don't want to know what is your temperature now, but let's say in pregnancy you want to follow up the change of of the temperature through at least nine months, and so on. Then, of course, there are some potential problems, like you try to promote it, but there are some people who are very touchy now. They just become afraid. Oh, have a look, my temperature today is 37.1. Am I ill? What am I having? And so on and so on. So I won't go to all these points because of the lack of time. What we did is a series of different kinds of sensors. Many of them are measuring more than one physiological or kinematic values, and some of them are also like individual sensors that are attached to different kinds of the bodies. And for the purposes of our project, what we were doing was that we collected this data on a mobile unit where the decision was made whether the status of the patients was okay. Then there was no action. Then we had also alarm if we saw that somebody entered some malignant tachycardia, let's say, or the warning when we lost the signal or we were not sure at the level of the microprocessor in this wearable unit whether the results may be dangerous for the patient or not. The large project that we had was also with the diabetics. So you see, diabetics type 2 are usually elderly people, so that overlaps with our other projects. So we also made some innovation like this weight that is also integrating a scanning device, so that one of the problems that the diabetic patients have is the distribution of the pressure when walking and so on, that we could find the critical areas. And of course, we tried to cover the patients all the time, so that at home and at work they usually had some contact points, and we were using the mobile phones to connect to the network when the patients were out of the known environment. Then the combination of all this data that we were collecting made us also possible, because these were our products, that we introduced some of the patient-specific data into decision-making for different patients, which is now something that we call personalized medical help. Then also we were tracking some of the issues that are not being considered health itself, but it is like the physical activity. We were promoting physical activity, promoting exercising, and then measuring to see whether the movements that the patient were doing were correct in terms of the needs for the rehabilitation or well-being, or whether they were making some movements that might have probably been dangerous for these patients themselves. These are some of the details what we were all collecting and measuring. Different positions of the sensors. The data that you get from these inertial measurement units are quite noisy, and then it's sometimes difficult to make the information out of these records. So we use some analysis methods in time and frequency domains. So on your right-hand side, you can see a specific frequency, let's say, signature of one of the exercises, and on the next slide, on the next picture in this slide, you can see actually some of the movements in time domain. And then you make different kind of the filtering to define the start and the end of a movement, and then each of the exercises has its typical signature, so that you can compare whether you are working well according to some golden standards. For some of the patients, the golden standard is extracted from their data, for some of the patients from some other expert. Anyway, by changing these particular signatures of the exercises, you can see that when it changes in time or in frequency domain, that you get tired with one of the movements and then you have to stop exercising. These are some results of the classifications, how well we can recognize some of the exercises, because the idea here in order to reduce the cost is to have a minimal number of sensors. If you have 10 sensors on the body, it's not at all difficult to recognize a particular exercise, but if we only one or two, then it may be much more difficult. So we made some of the experiments for the activities of daily living, which include walking, going up and down the stairs, jumping, and so on. And we also included falls into these activities. Fall is not activity actually that we want to do, but with elderly people it happens from time to time. So our main goal here was to distinguish activities of daily living from the falls. Of course, walking, to distinguish the walking against falling, that's easy. But sitting down, standing up, that's much more difficult, because these are the so-called jerk movements, and the signatures are very similar in time domain and in frequency domain. So that after the analysis, these are the signatures of different kind of daily activities and also of the falls. The last three ones are the signatures of the falls. We also introduced an altimeter as the second sensor that is following the activity, and on your right hand side you can see a very, very noisy signal that you get from the altimeter, but still you can distinguish the difference in the level of the position of the sensor when a person is, let's say, standing and when he or she fell down. So that actually when you have a look and when you compare the signals that you get from the altimeter, this is also on the right hand side, and on the upper part of the image you can see the accelerometer data and the impact when the person fell. Then you can see that when you combine the two signals that you can get from the altimeter, actually the confirmation that the sensor, let's say, from the position on the hip of the patient is on a lower level, that means that the patient had fallen. So system integration is something that we are working on right now. And these are now some of the statistical analyses where we can show how many of these data is useful for some independent decision making. Because, you can say, okay, it doesn't matter. Let's say we will allow some of the false positives. But if you are in an institution where they have 100 old people and 15% of false positives, they don't care about it. They don't want to go, the sisters, the nurses, they don't want to visit the patients in their rooms just to see whether he fell. So they want to be, let's say, 95% sure that the patients really fell, and so on. So this is also the sociological aspect of the problem, but for us who are technicians, who are engineers, who want to solve the problem, we would like to have 100%. We know that's impossible, but we are streaming now to 95, 96, 97. So every change in the software we make, and within 1%, it's a large achievement when you come to more than 90% of the accuracy. And these are also some of the data showing which pairs of data and parameters are the best for a particular combination. So I won't go into analysis of that, so that I can say thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I will try to give you the answers. Thank you very much.
¿Tienen preguntas?
Okay, well, have a look. First of all, I would like to say that you have to have passion for biomedical engineering. So I expect, since you are studying biomedical engineering, that you have the passion. And you know, that means that you really want to be active. So the activities of the student population within the IFMB is mainly based on spreading the information about what biomedical engineering is, how you can help, and also including into the international groups who stay connected. We have, let's say, the examples of the fellowships, travel fellowships that were implemented in Southeast Asia. So those of the students who were active like 20 years ago are now meeting practically every World Congress, and they still collaborate. So you really must try to have this network and to develop it. You know, it's always nice to go for a beer or a coffee with your closest friends, but you also have to start thinking on these business aspects of your studies. That mean that sometimes in the future you will need an expert to help you develop something. Because, have a look, I'm in the field of biomedical engineering for approximately 30 years. And when I started being a biomedical engineer, then this was the era where you had mainly integrated circuits and microprocessors. So there are no from-the-shelf or on-the-shelf software for solving your problem. You had to start each and every software from the scratch. Okay, we are talking now about the embedded software, which is in different kind of devices. Today, you actually take everything from the shelf. You just integrate different parts of programming, filtering, extracting the features and so on. These are products that you are using from the web, from the open sources, from some of the programs that are dedicated from some of these things. But still, you see, you have to have the understanding of the problem. I was talking about the need of the accurate data. This is one very important thing, but you have to understand what is happening behind. Otherwise, you cannot judge whether you are getting good results or not. So, in this sense, if you really want to bring some innovation and some products to the market, it's not enough that you are a biomedical engineer who is trained to design software. Medical software is a medical device or hardware. You have to have, it's at least now, let's say, a software and a hardware engineer who have to collaborate. But then you also, if you want to have a product, then you have to think about, let's say, the usability. That means to design a proper housing for your device, because many of the medical devices today are being are wearables. So how to put it, where to put it, how much, how weight can this device have? So this is, like also one of the questions. More battery, longer recording, but a heavier device, which is now the optimal ratio of the two, and so on. And you need to have somebody who is helping you in making all of these decisions. As I said, among yourselves, different universities in Mexico, in Latin America, and then in the world. I'm always very happy when I visit the congresses in Latin America, that there is always a large number of students present. So this conference that was like a week ago in Hermosillo, it was about 800 to 900 participants, and probably 2/3 of those were the students. And then you see, how to do it. Well, it's something that usually makes the students happy. Let's say they had some artificial environment, so that you could put the glasses and then you do something that clinical engineers do in their praxis. Then they had another game on how to keep a department in a hospital, and what you need, then you have to buy, and something like Monopoly and so on, so on. So these are just new ideas. Let's say I never had seen such a. Okay, so I have to stop. Thank you for the question, Fabiola. Thank you for your attendance. I will be here for another few hours, so if you have any questions for me, please approach me. If not, Professora Fabiola can give you my email and you can send me an email or WhatsApp message or whatsoever. Thank you.
Gracias. So this is, agradecemos su presencia y su plática. It was very interesting, and we will talk later through the day on some issues. Si los alumnos quieren hablar con él en un ratito a la hora de la pausa, va a estar todavía unas horas aquí con nosotros. Gracias.
Thank you very much.
This is our mascot.
Mascot, yeah, of course. I even know that it is a Spanish word, mascot, because I have some pets. I have 2 dogs at home, so this will be the third one.
A continuación vamos a tener la presentación de la doctora Megan Horton. Ella es una científica y epidemióloga del medio ambiente y trabaja en el Icahn School of Medicine en el Hospital Monte Sinaí en Nueva York, donde ella hace investigación sobre el impacto de la exposición al medio ambiente en la salud de los niños, en particular la parte de la neurotoxicidad de metales pesados. Ella hizo su licenciatura en la Universidad de Loyola en Chicago, su maestría y doctorado en la Universidad de Columbia, y ha trabajado con un montón de equipos interdisciplinarios. Nosotros lo que tenemos es la fortuna de haber colaborado con ella y de estar colaborando con ella en estos proyectos de seguimiento de niños que han tenido exposición a metales pesados. Parte de su investigación la hace aquí en colaboración con Rafael Lara. Entonces los dejo con la doctora Megan Horton. Yes.
My talk today is the neuroexposome. So I'll be talking about data-driven approaches supporting new research questions in children's environmental health. Many of us are familiar at this point in time with the term exposome. Exposome is a term developed to complement the Human Genome Project to discuss the extent of all environmental exposures in a lifetime and how those can affect health outcomes. So it's a widely used concept, increasingly used to start to think about not just single exposures, but multiple exposures that could be from environmental sources or social sources, and in particular looking at them over the lifetime. The focus of this talk and the focus of my group is more specifically the neuroexposome. So the neuroexposome is the concept not only of the whole exposome, but it's the brain's distinctive responses to these exposures and the impact on brain health and disease throughout the life course. So the challenge in my lab and our interest is to link high dimensional exposure data, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by high dimensional exposure data, with the dynamic and highly dimensional neurodevelopmental outcomes, combining some of the tools we use to assess exposure, and I'll talk about baby teeth, with MRI and then some statistics to understand how early life environmental exposures can predispose an individual to adverse health outcomes. So the neuroexposome, as I mentioned, is combining endogenous factors such as genetics, metabolism, microbiome, with exogenous factors like environmental toxicants, light, noise, climate, and also behavioral factors like psychosocial stressors. In my lab, we'll focus on specific components of this exposome. So in particular, I'm interested in this concept of early life critical windows of exposure that can occur during pregnancy and early childhood when the brain is very rapidly developing. In order to study these, I'll talk about our use of deciduous, naturally shed baby teeth, how we reconstruct environmental exposures through time from gestation through early childhood using these teeth. We'll also talk about exposure to time series mixtures. And as in the introduction, I'll focus on exposure to a mixture of metal compounds, both neurotoxicant metals and nutrient metals, and think about that mixture over time. So I'll talk about a statistical method that was developed here at Mount Sinai called LAG-WQS to combine these exposure mixtures. And we'll talk about our interest in adolescent brain health, and in particular, the work that we're doing in collaboration with Rafa and Emilio at CI3M, where we're using MRI to look at structural and functional changes in the brain, and also behavioral outcomes. So do these environmental exposures put a child at increased risk for behavioral outcomes like depression or anxiety, or for high-risk behaviors like drinking and alcohol use? So this concept of critical windows, I'll begin with a brief discussion of critical windows. The concept of critical windows initiated from work accomplished by David Barker in the 1980s. David Barker was a physician working in England, and he was the first to tie chronic disease in adulthood to growth patterns in early life. So he studied birth certificates and death certificates. And by studying the birth and death records, he noticed a link between low birth weight babies and the risk for dying from coronary heart disease as an adult. So he developed this hypothesis, or the DOAD hypothesis, the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis, that stated early life nutrition and growth is an important factor for determining whether a baby will grow up to be more or less vulnerable to cardiac and metabolic outcomes. This theory stimulated interest in the fetal origins of adult disease. So it was really our first understanding that something that happened very early in fetal development could have long-term effects on the adult. Barker's hypothesis stimulated a great deal of worldwide interest in this developmental toxicity and plasticity and this idea of critical windows. And it rapidly gained acceptance in popular culture. So this is a magazine from the early 2000s where the cover was how the first 9 months of life shape the rest of your life. So thinking about the fetal origins of disease. And it was about this point that the DOAD hypothesis expanded from early life nutritional factors to include early life environmental factors. So not just nutrition, but environmental toxicant exposures and social exposures. In addition to Barker's hypothesis, or prior to Barker's hypothesis, much of what led to our understanding of critical windows and developmental plasticity came from the thalidomide disaster of the 1950s. Prior to this public health disaster, the idea that the placenta was a perfect barrier was still current. So physicians believed that a toxicant would only affect the fetus if it caused major illness or disease in the mother. And pregnant women were not counseled about the dangers of medications or alcohol, and new drugs were not thoroughly tested for their safety during pregnancy. So nearly 60 years ago, thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women to treat morning sickness. It was a sedative and a very effective sedative that was prescribed to hundreds of thousands of women, or hundreds of thousands of women, and led to one of the largest human-made medical disasters ever, where over 10,000 children were born with a range of severe and debilitating malformations. So this is what the kids whose moms took thalidomide during pregnancy were born with, these very unique and specific malformations. What was very different about the thalidomide disaster than the environmental health work that we do now is that because this was a drug that was prescribed by a doctor, we knew, or epidemiologists could link when and how much of this drug the moms took during pregnancy with very unique and specific health outcomes in the children. So this is a copy of a graphic from a paper published in the 1960s that's showing the timing of when the mom took the drug and what the outward damage was caused by thalidomide. And so what it's looking at is the days post-conception. So these are very early during pregnancy. And if the mom took a drug at very specific time points, there was a very specific outcome. So for example, here, if the mom took the drug very early when the external ear was developing, then that external ear could be missing. If that drug was taken later, the external ear was fine. However, there may be problems with the limbs because the limbs were developing later in that gestational period. So this led to this concept of critical windows. This is another graphic expanding on this idea of critical windows, looking at, on the top, we're looking at weeks of embryonic period, so embryonic and then fetal periods, from very early during pregnancy through to birth or gestation. And what it's showing in the purple versus the green is sensitive periods, less sensitive periods versus highly sensitive periods. So you can see that if an organ or a system was developing at that time, it was considered more highly sensitive, rather than if it was already fully developed and then it was less sensitive to perturbation. So the conclusion from this work that was summarizing some of David Barker's work and the work from thalidomide and other examples was that an exposure, particularly an adverse exposure, that's coincident with a developmental process is more likely to cause adverse health effects. So this idea of critical windows. If you're thinking about some of these limbs and facial features, the palate, these have a very distinct critical window that closes. If you think about other organs of the body, so things like the liver and the kidneys, and in particular the brain, the window of the critical window is considerably longer. So we now know from work, from both animals and humans suggesting that the development of the human brain is both the slowest growing and the longest developing organ of the human body. And so while it begins developing very early in this prenatal period, so around here, indicating months prior to birth, there's this rapid uptick in development of these different functions, including the sensory pathways, language development, and higher cognitive functions. If we could, this was published, I believe, in the 1990s. And if we could redo this graphic, as I would like to, we would extend many of these lines far beyond the teenage years as we learn more about continued myelination and development of the brain throughout the 20s and even into the early 30s. So this is demonstrating that the brain has this very long and extended critical window of development, during which it may be vulnerable to perturbation by environmental chemicals. Although I keep your eyes here in this early period where the slopes are certainly the steepest and the most dramatic because there's the most development going on early on. So this ties into the MRI and the techniques that we're using to understand developmental trajectories of brain structure and function using MRI. So it's probably not particularly relevant to many of you in this group, but a brief tutorial of how MRI works is useful to understand the data that we're getting. And so in very brief, MRI scans work as an imaging method largely due to the unique composition of the human body. We're comprised entirely of cells which contain water, principally made up of hydrogen and oxygen, and the positively charged hydrogen atoms are pictured here in the figure on the left. So the magnet, which is embedded in the scanner, can act on these positively charged hydrogen atoms and cause them to spin in identical manner. Without the magnet, you can see on the left that they're rotating in this random alignment. So they're randomly rotating around, the positive ions moving randomly. And then when you put them in the magnet, all of those positive ions line up within the magnetic field. So they spin in this identical manner. By varying the strength and the direction of the magnetic field, we can change the direction or the spin of the protons, the hydrogen atoms, enabling us to build layers and layers of details. When the magnetic field is changed or when the magnet is switched off, these protons will gradually return into their original state, known as precession. So fundamentally, the critical piece is that different tissue types within the body return at different rates. And this is what allows us to visualize and differentiate between different tissues of the body with very high spatial resolution. So in sum, MRI allows us unprecedented access to the anatomy and physiology of the developing brain without the use of radiation. And over the past 2 decades, I'll show you some slides demonstrating that thousands of brain MRIs from healthy youth and those with neuropsychiatric illnesses have been acquired and analyzed to predict or to think about and track these developmental trajectories of brain structure over time and brain function over time. Some of the basic modalities that we can look at and things that we can image are structural MRI. So structural MRI measures the anatomy of the brain, namely gray matter and white matter. So gray matter volume can be composed or decomposed into cortical thickness and cortical surface area. Cortical thickness is the combined thickness of the cerebral cortex layers and is associated, and then there's cortical surface area, which is the area of the white matter surface and is related to neuronal migration. And interestingly, cortical surface area and cortical thickness have distinct neurodevelopmental trajectories. So they're growing at different rates and at different times. And then you can look at overall brain volume and volume of different cortical and subcortical structures. Another commonly used modality of MRI that we use in my lab is functional MRI. Functional MRI is a proxy for brain activation and relies on blood oxygenated dependent signal, or the bold signal, which is briefly is depicted up here on the right, where the theory is that a brain region that's activated has more demand for oxygen and for glucose, so for oxygenated blood, and oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood have a very different bold signal that can be detected once you're in the magnet. And so in a basic state or in a resting state, there's a balance between the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. However, when demanded to do a task, there's more activation, or in this activated state, there's an increased demand for oxygen and an increased demand for glucose, which causes an increase in local blood flow. The deoxygenated blood is decreased and the bold signal is increased. So we can use this as a proxy to look at activation in the brain. Often this is done with a task. So something like asking a participant to tap their fingers while in the scanner or do a memory task. And so we look at what does the brain look like when they're undergoing the task versus when they're not undergoing the task, and thus find areas of the brain that are more activated during this functional MRI scan. Critical to my work and much of the work that's being done in children is resting state fMRI. So increasingly, studies in children rely on this modality because it can be done and capture activation in the brain without having the child perform a task. And so resting state uses temporal correlations of spontaneous fluctuations in the bold signal. So it's based on the understanding that most energy consumption in the brain is related to intrinsic activity that is not related to the external stimuli. So this paper by Reichle in 2001 suggested that what's happening at the brain at rest is representative of correlations or of connections that are active during a task. And so you can see that here in this figure on the bottom, where we're looking at the bold signal of areas of the brain that we anticipate to be connected. So the right and left motor cortex are working together when you're doing a motor task. And in fact, at rest, they're correlated very highly, and you can see that in the image. We wouldn't expect the same correlation between the left motor cortex and the left visual cortex, and that's demonstrated with the difference or a very low correlation in their bold signals over time. Another modality that we use is diffuser tension tensor imaging, or DTI, which is a variant of conventional MRI that's tracking the rate of water as it moves through different tissues. So DTI uses the Brownian motion, or the diffusion of water molecules in the white matter, as a probe to reveal the white matter microstructure, including the orientation. So not just where the fibers are, but which way the fibers are going. So the basic concept behind DTI is that water molecules diffuse differently along tissues depending on their architecture and their integrity. So it's also a marker for myelination, because there's increased anisotropy, or movement through that fiber, if there's increased myelination. So these are examples of images that you can get from diffuser tensor imaging, looking at where the white matter tracks are, and then the colors indicate the movement or the directionality of that white matter microstructure. So I'll talk a little bit about work that we're doing with overall FA values, or fractional anisotropy values, that are representing, or we think are a proxy for, the white matter microstructure. So as I mentioned, MRI has been done over the last MRI has been performed on healthy and neuropathological children and adolescents over the past couple decades, to try to understand the developmental trajectories of different parts of the brain. And in this figure on the left, I'm showing you from a paper by Geet and Rappaport in 2010, looking at developmental trajectories of different regions of the brain, with years on the x-axis, and then separated by males and females, males in blue and females in red. And you can see that, for example, with the white matter, there's an increasing trajectory over time, while in total brain volume and in gray matter, there's more like this U-shaped curve, where it peaks in the beginning of adolescence and then decreases over time. So this is demonstrating a couple of things. One, that there's a nonlinear trajectory of overall brain volume development, and that there's a difference between white matter and gray matter. So you wouldn't expect to see the same things if you're looking at these things over time. So you see a protracted dynamic maturation of the brain. You see a increasingly linear white matter development, and an inverted U in gray matter, and that there's peak development at different times. This is similar to the what's shown in the right. This is a figure of cortical gray matter changes among children who are 4 to 20 years of age. And I think they took, there are a small number of individuals, I think 13 to 15 individuals, who were scanned 4 times at 2-year intervals over this time. And what we're looking at is the gray matter density, the gray matter volume in the scales ranging from red to purple. And you can see that the gray matter is most dense in the primary sensory motor areas, and then develops latest in the higher order prefrontal cortex. And we can also look at this developmental trajectories of brain development using functional MRI. So this is from resting state data, looking at the sequence of development and the extent of connectivity in normally developing children and in adults. So the representation that we're looking at here is the difference between, in the red lines, sorry, I'll start with the blue lines, are areas of the brain where there's functionality is greater in adults than in children, and in red, it's the children greater than adults. And so if we look at this here, we can see that children have higher subcortical connectivity in the green and lower paralimbic connectivity in the gold. And so what that suggests is, in the children, there's higher sensory motor activity versus some of the higher ordered cognitive functions. And that's reversed when we start to look over here, where there's a higher density in the adults over the children. So this, again, though it's a little bit of a confusing figure, is demonstrating that not only can we see changes in brain development structurally, we can see changes in brain development functionally over this adolescent period into adulthood. This is a slide from a paper that was published in 2022 from the Bethlehem group, looking at neurodevelopmental milestones over hundreds of thousands of MRI scans completed in different populations, looking at the trajectory of different MRI phenotypes, as they call them. So gray matter, white matter, subcortical volume, etc. And there's 2 points that I want to walk away from this figure. Again, it's that rapid increase in growth in that fetal and early infant period, right here. And then there's this trajectory that plateaus around adolescence, demonstrating that's important when you're thinking about these developmental trajectories to hypothesize what you're looking at and what you would anticipate seeing before this plateau and then some of this decrease in volume or in functionality over time. And so again, I draw you specifically to these areas right here in early, in gestation and early childhood, and then late in life, and we'll think about how that ties into what we're studying, that I'll get to in just a few slides. One of the challenges that we want to talk about next is how do we measure environmental exposures during this time period? And so how do we think about early life environmental exposures? Accurate exposure assessment is one of the major challenges in life course epidemiology, particularly in investigations of prenatal exposure. In humans, estimating gestational exposure is challenging, and assessments are limited to measures of maternal biospecimens, so largely blood and urine that's collected at time points during pregnancy. But in order to ethically perform research in a mom during pregnancy, it's unlikely that we could get more than 1, 2, or maybe 3 blood samples in a large number of women over time, because we don't want to burden the mom too much. So we often try to coincide a blood sample collection along with a regularly scheduled visit. And we can get urine samples, but there are some problems with both of these in that they're both indirect proxies for fetal exposure. And they may not reflect the fetal or infant exposure throughout pregnancy or throughout development. I highlight one example. In addition to the metals work I'm talking about, we do a lot of work studying residential pesticide exposure, so pesticide exposure that was used to prevent cockroaches in homes. And in a study that I worked on at Columbia University, we measured compounds including chlorpyrifos, a common residential pesticide that was used in the prior decades. And we looked at chlorpyrifos levels both in the mom and in umbilical cord blood samples. And what we found was that the levels in the cord blood samples were significantly higher than those that we found in the mom's blood, which suggested that fetal exposure was actually higher. We now know that this was due to maternal metabolism, that the fetus didn't have the right equipment at that point to metabolize chlorpyrifos. So levels in chlorpyrifos in the fetus were actually higher than the mom's. This is again reflecting that blood samples and or urine samples may not be a good proxy for fetal exposure. Because of reasons like this, Manisha Arora and Christine Austin, faculty here at Mount Sinai, expanded on the work that had already been done looking at the use of deciduous, naturally shed baby teeth. We know that children lose 20 deciduous or baby teeth between the ages of 5 and 13. And we know that trees grow, or that teeth grow somewhat like trees. And so they lay similar to the way a tree lays a growth ring. The fetus, beginning in the 2nd trimester of pregnancy, begins to develop its teeth, laying a layer of enamel and dentine on a daily basis until the time the tooth is shed, so around 5 to 13 years of age. Manish and Christine aren't the first to use teeth as a biomarker. Herb Nadelman, who is a pioneer in understanding the adverse impacts of lead on children's IQ, he had done early studies with lead exposure using baby teeth, but one of the differences is that he took the whole tooth and he ground it up and looked at lead exposure using the whole tooth. What Christine and Manish really developed was this concept of timing based on the physiology of the tooth that allows us to look with very high temporal resolution at exposures in the tooth over time. So this is just a schematic of a human incisor. So we're looking here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but what we're looking at here is the pulp. So this is where the blood flow is. This PD is the primary dentine. So this is the part of the tooth that grows first and is first erupting from the gum. And then there's a secondary dentine. And so if you look at this over time, so this is looking at gestation, birth, and postnatally, you can see that as the tooth is growing up and erupting from the gum, extension of the tooth is growing down by this daily layer. And critical to this work, or an important feature, is this neonatal line. So about 90% of deciduous teeth have this visible growth line that forms at birth due to the temporary restriction of tooth growth while the feeding transitions from maternal blood to the fetal digestive system develop. So this neonatal line is a reference for the day of birth. So you can mark this line and backtrack the prenatal period and work forward for the postnatal period. So this is an example of the lead distribution in a single tooth from one of our study participants. This is a ICP-MS map showing the distribution of lead on a color scale, this on the left. So what we're looking at in the bright red is lead levels in the tooth. And we kind of ignore this down here because this is where the pulp was. So this is where the blood is circulating or was circulating. And so we're focused right here on this line and comparing this line to the comparing this line to the timeline or the developmental time over here. So this is on the right is a graphic representation of what we're seeing in color. So this is weeks of birth or days of birth going from the -150, so the second trimester of pregnancy, through birth, and then just shy of a year of age. And this is looking at the lead levels controlled for calcium in the tooth. And what we see is this dramatic spike in lead right around the third trimester of pregnancy. For those of you that are familiar with fetal development, know that in the third trimester of pregnancy, there's exponential growth of the fetal skeletal system. So many of the, the facial features, the limbs, the cardiac, the lungs, most of those are fully developed. And now there's just this exponential growth. And so the fetus is really pulling a lot of nutrients out of the mom's blood and out of the mom's bone. And so what they're looking for is some of that calcium. And we know that calcium and lead have very similar chemical makeup. And so if there's lead in that mom's bone, the fetus is going to be pulling that lead out of her bone, circulating it in its bloodstream, and so it'll be encapsulated in that tooth. And that's exactly what we see, is that there's this peak of lead exposure. What I want to note from this figure is that it demonstrates the importance of looking over time, because if we had collected a sample of blood from maybe the child around a year, or if we collected a second trimester sample from the mom, we would have missed this high point. And so we would have biased our association to the null by missing this exposure. We've now expanded far beyond looking at the 3 original metals. We used to, the first validated metals to look at in the teeth were lead, manganese, and zinc. And now we're looking at upwards of 16 different metals, taking this metallomic approach to our analyses. And these are graphics, again, looking at prenatal period, birth, and postnatal period of the metal mixture in 2 different teeth from child participants. And I didn't in this graphic demonstrate which metals we're looking at. What I just want to see is this, what I want you to see is this, these temporal fluctuations in exposure to metals over time, demonstrating that if we looked at only a single time point, we might miss these high fluctuations or low fluctuations, which might interrupt our ability to do our analyses and understand how metals impact development. So this is I just pulled lead, manganese, and zinc out so we can look and see in another way how these metals are changing over time. So these are weeks of gestation from that -20th week up until about 40 weeks, and showing how the metal exposures change over time. So now we're talking about not just a single exposure at a single time point. So we can no longer look at lead at a single time point and IQ. We now have not just a mixture of compounds at a single time point, but we have mixtures at multiple time points. So that forced the development of new statistical methods that could handle this high dimensional exposure that's high dimensional not only in terms of the number of analytes in the mixture, but the number of time points that we can look at. So this concept of time-resolved mixtures. So in order to do this, Chris Jennings, who's a statistician here at Mount Sinai, developed what's called the weighted quantile sum regression, which is a method designed to look at correlated compounds in an index. So we can look at the mixture of correlated compounds, how those affect an outcome. And then critically, we can look back and see what were the heavy hitters or the most influential compounds in that mixture. So I give an example here of looking at metal mixtures. So arsenic, barium, cadmium, manganese, all down to zinc. So you could put as many metals in this mixture as you want to. You look at the association between the individual metal and the outcome. So for this instance, we could say we're looking at total brain volume. And then you determine the empirical weights of each individual variable or individual factor. And then performing a nonlinear regression with a bootstrap, you do an ensemble step so that you can combine these into a single weighted index. That weight is constrained to sum to 0 to 1. And what that allows us to do, because of this sum to 0 to 1, is if we see a significant association between this weighted index and the outcome, we can backtrack and see, like I said, which one was the heavy hitter, what percentage was associated with barium, what percentage was associated with manganese. Is there a heavy hitter, or is it a small contribution of each one of these components of the mixture? The other strength of using WQS is that we can look both in the positive and negative direction. So we can look both to see whether this mixture was associated with an increase in the outcome or whether it was associated with a decrease in the outcome. And we think that's very critical when we're looking at things like metal exposure, because we know that some metals like lead have no safe threshold, or no level is allowable, or no level is nutrient level. And so we would always be looking in the direction that there's a negative health outcome. But if we're thinking about some of the other chemicals, particularly like manganese or copper, where we know that they're critical for brain development, critical for health, but they need to be at the right time and at the right level. So we can look in both the positive and negative direction to look at neurotoxicant exposures and neuroprotective or neurosupportive exposures. The lag WQS builds on the concept of the WQS to extend this framework from looking at a mixture at a single time point to be able to look at mixtures at multiple time points. And so this was Chris working with a statistician, Paul Curtin, to expand the WQS into a lag WQS, combining the concept of the distributed lag model. So just a preview, or just a reminder, that the WQS, the generalized WQS, was for the single time point. And the lag WQS is kind of like looking at WQS over time. So there's a WQS in our case for each week of dentine development from week 1 would correlate to that beginning of the second trimester out to week 42, which is when we've which is when we have tooth data at this point. But it's the same concept where we're looking at the association between the mixture at week 1 and the outcome, and then week 2 at the outcome, all the way up until week 42. And we apply a smoother so that we can look at those all in the same timeline and determine when is a potential sensitive window. So the way we look at this data is this figure on the upper right, where we see time in weeks, with birth being right here, the prenatal period and the postnatal period. And what we're looking at in this smooth black line is the time-varying association between the metal mixture and the health outcome along this time, when the lighter gray bands are the 95% confidence interval. And so here, where we see the black band and the gray bands dip below 0, that's the suggestion of a critical window at that time point right around birth. So how do we pull that all together? And this is the work that we're doing at CI3M within the progress cohort to look at how environmental exposures can impact brain development. The progress study was initiated in Mexico City between 2006 and 2011 by Dr. Wright, who's a faculty member here, and Dr. Mara Velez Rojo at INSP. They enrolled over 1,000 healthy pregnant women and performed extensive exposure assessment during pregnancy and longitudinally. And now the kids are around 16 years of age. So they've done both satellite and ground monitoring. They've collected blood samples, urine samples from the moms and the kids, placentas from the moms or from the babies. They do some bone measures. And of course, they collected teeth, which we'll be talking about. And postnatally, they've followed the kids, now I can say, up to around 16. And they focused on different health outcomes like growth and obesity, respiratory health, and neurodevelopment. So in the study that I lead in progress is an MRI sub-study. And so we currently have about 650 of those original 1,000 that we still follow. And we've pulled a smaller subset into an MRI cohort so that we can link the teeth measures with the MRI and fMRI measures. This is another way of thinking about and depicting how we're pulling together some of these novel tools to ask questions about early life environmental exposures. So we're looking at the metal mixtures in the teeth and behavioral outcomes in the kids. So thinking about anxiety, depression, risk-taking, motor function, other different neurodevelopmental outcomes. And we're looking at MRI, and I'll talk about how we're using some of those modalities I discussed earlier. And then this lag WQS to pull it all together and see whether we can demonstrate that early life environmental exposure to metal mixtures has adverse outcomes on the adolescents. This is the work that I'll talk about now was led by Elza Reckman in my lab. So Elsa is particularly interested in understanding externalizing and internalizing problems. So we read that it was upwards of 30 to 40% of adolescents in Mexico City report having some sort of internalizing or externalizing problems, so anxiety, depression, or hyperactivity. And we know that internalizing and externalizing problems are linked to unemployment, could be linked to criminal convictions, lower earnings, intimate partner problems, poor health, and overall earlier mortality. So this is one of the outcomes of the progress study, is understanding that. And we use a questionnaire that was administered both to the moms and to the children to understand internalizing and externalizing problems. These are some of the demographics of the progress participants, including those that were that had all the available data when we were looking at these kids, and then the subset of kids in this analysis that have MRI. So they're mixed pretty evenly by sex. They're performing pretty average towards the mean on the BASC. So this is meaning that we are capturing a generally healthy population that has a range in behavioral outcomes, but very few have been diagnosed with neurodevelopmental disorders. This is a demonstration of the tooth metals that we're looking at in the kids that had teeth analyzed by the time we did this. So we're looking at 9 different metals: barium, copper, lithium, magnesium, manganese, lead, tin, strontium, and zinc. So a mixture of both neurotoxicant chemicals like manganese and lead, and also neuroprotective chemicals like tin and zinc. So we looked at the using the lag WQS, we looked at the association between this metal mixture in the prenatal and early postnatal period and behavioral problems assessed by the BASC. So this is a measure, the BSI, or Behavioral Symptoms Index, is a measure of overall behavioral symptoms. So it's capturing both the hyperactivity and the anxiety, depression. So as you saw in the method slide, we're looking at time on the x-axis, so birth at 0, the prenatal period and the postnatal period. And we're looking at that time-varying effect of the metal mixture on the BASC. And what we see is that there's this small prenatal window suggesting that there's a significant association between the metal mixture at this early postnatal period and adverse health outcomes. And a stronger window here around 40 weeks. So in the in the late postnatal period, so almost getting towards a year. And so what we did is look at the weights. So which metals are driving these associations in these significant windows? And all 9 metals that we looked at are represented here. It's a little bit messy, so I draw your attention to the same time periods that we're looking at in the graphic on the left. So this early postnatal period, which seems to be driven largely by manganese, magnesium, copper, and strontium. And then this later postnatal period, so around 1 year of life, where we see associations that are also driven by manganese and magnesium, but also we see a change. So we see more tin and zinc coming in. So the take-home point is that we seem to see 2 critical windows associated with increased behavioral problems. One is at that early postnatal period, and the other is at that later postnatal period. We then looked at the association between the metal mixture and global brain outcomes. So we looked at total brain volume. So again, it's we're looking here at the time on the x-axis and that slope representing the time-varying effect of the mixture on total brain volume. And we see that there is this later postnatal window with a peak right around, I think this is right around 30, 32 weeks. And if we look at the metals that are driving this association in the brain, again, we see a heavy hit by manganese, zinc, and strontium. We looked at the FA values. So this is, again, that white matter microstructure that we get from the DTI, looking at the metal mixture and the weights of the metals driving this. We see a small prenatal window this time, looking at that, demonstrating an association between the metal mixture during that fetal development and adverse health outcomes, or reduced FA in the children. And then this postnatal window that's very similar to that we see with total brain volume. And again, these are driven by manganese. Interestingly, we see, this is actually a typo, but we do see a difference in the window in the metals that were prenatal versus postnatal. Finally, we looked at global network efficiency. So this is a way to use that resting state data to look at global network efficiency, or how is the connectivity and functional connectivity across the brain related to that metal mixture. And we see this prenatal window and a postnatal window, driven again by manganese and lead. So we did a couple other things. So if here what we're demonstrating is an association between that metal mixture and behavioral outcomes, and a similar association or time points with the metal mixture and brain outcomes. So we moved on a little bit to look at how does that associate with other behavioral outcomes. And as I mentioned, we were getting very interested in these adolescents with risk-taking. And while we know that risk-taking is evolutionarily advantageous, we have to take risks in order to develop and be social, to build our networks, to be safe. Maladaptive risk-taking or excessive risk-taking in terms of drinking, unsafe sexual practices, and exposure to increasing engagement with violence, those things can be considered maladaptive risk-taking. And so we looked specifically in the brain at whether or not these kids were taking more risks and whether or not their brains were acting differently when they were taking risks. So this is work led by Eric DeWater, who was a postdoc in my lab, and Christy Olyumi, who's currently a PhD student, who administered what's called the cake gambling task. And this is a variation of the Cambridge gambling task, which is more useful in adults, where you can look at changes in the functional changes in the brain during a risk-taking or decision task. And so the kids laid in the scanner and they were asked to choose between high and low risk gambles, each associated with different rewards. And so we could look at through this, we could look at risk-taking tendency, reward sensitivity, and risk sensitivity. So all different ways to capture how are these kids' brains acting when they're taking risks and when they're getting rewards. And I'll focus on two of these and look at them with the lag WQS. So for this one, we're looking at dentine metal exposure, so the tooth metals, and risk sensitivity. So how sensitive were these kids to increased risk? And you can see this is the same type of graphic looking at the same metals, and we see this prenatal window and a postnatal window. And so when we look at the metals, in these peak weeks, we can see the metals in green represent the metals that are driving the association in the prenatal period, which is largely manganese and lead. And then in the postnatal period, we see addition of other metals, similar to what we'd seen in the behavioral outcomes, where we see the increase in the weight from zinc and tin. And then we also looked at reward sensitivity, so trying to capture the multiple dynamics of risk-taking. And you can see again the prenatal period and the postnatal period, and that there's more metals coming into play here. In the prenatal period, we're still seeing some lead driving that association, and in the postnatal period, we see increases in other metals such as barium, lithium, and strontium coming in that we hadn't seen before. This is a summary of some of the associations that we're seeing in these two outcomes. So in risk sensitivity, we're seeing a window prenatally and postnatally. Prenatally, it seems to be led by manganese, barium, and lead. And postnatally, we see additional metals or a greater contribution of more metals. And reward sensitivity, we see a critical window in the prenatal in prenatal month 5 that seems to be driven by zinc, copper, magnesium, and lead. And in that postnatal period, we see this association driven by a large number of metals. What this may suggest is that the larger number of metals may mean that the exposure has changed after birth. So keep in mind that these prenatal period, the fetus is somewhat protected or may be somewhat protected by metals, and there may be some metabolism or clearance on the part of the mom. And then after birth, there could be more exposure, particularly during this period of around 9 months, 6 months to 9 months. There could be more hand-to-mouth activity. There's the introduction of more solid foods, so that infant could have increased exposure to some of these metals through foods during that critical transition from breastfeeding to solid foods. So in conclusion, today I think I've introduced you to new tools, including the dentine biomarker, the use of MRI and environmental neuroscience, and talked about statistical approaches, the LAG WQS, all of which allow us to ask novel questions about the neuroexposome and children's brain development. Using these new tools, we've identified critical windows of metal mixture exposure, both in the early prenatal period, or in the late prenatal period, and in that late postnatal window of about 6 to 9 months. I spend a minute, or I draw your attention to this critical window at 6 to 9 months, again, to emphasize that prior to the development of the tooth technology that Manish and Christine worked on so much, it was almost impossible to understand infants' exposure during this time point. Because if you've ever tried to collect a blood sample or a urine sample from a 6 to 9 month old, it's almost impossible. So it was really overlooked understanding what was happening or whether or not these were critical windows of exposure that could lead to later life health outcomes. So this is really revolutionary in terms of children's environmental health. So moving on, we demonstrated that the higher metal mixture index was associated with behavioral problems, with changes in risk-taking, and with structural and functional brain changes. Again, and that these persisted beyond that fetal period and infant period, all the way through till early adolescence. And that the associations were driven somewhat by lead, which we anticipated, but also by manganese, tin, zinc, and copper, which could be viewed as either neurotoxicant or neuroprotective metals. What we hope to do is impact public policy to protect children during these vulnerable periods and protect the mother during these periods. Because if we think again at this figure, while we're looking at health outcomes here that we think are this critical jumping off point to adulthood, the primary exposures or the influential exposures may be happening here, which is when we need to protect these vulnerable brains. So with that, I'll acknowledge the many, many people that contribute to this work. Chris Jennings, who developed method, Drs. Wright and Mara, who started the cohort, Adzura and Vernizzi and Elza, who did many of these analyses, and of course, Rafa, who runs the neuroimaging team at CI3M and helps us get all this good quality data from the children in the progress cohort, and finally the families and the participants and the field staff who spend so much time in the field and contributing their time to this work. And thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
So do we have any questions?
Hi, nice talk. I'm Layo from Guami. How do you excuse me how do you do the dentine analysis? What technique you use to see the layers?
So that's it's done by a laser ablation methodology. So they put the tooth in a laser, and the laser ablates material until it's collected into a template or into a matrix, and then they can, like I said, use that. They can identify the neonatal line and track forward and track backwards on that daily resolution.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. There's a window on the LED, a prenatal window. The data comes from statistics. So could we affirm that it doesn't matter what the mother takes? I mean, it's not a specific, what I mean is it's a time where the bone is formed, and that's what it makes it. There's nothing that the mom could do about it?
So that's not necessarily true. And I think one of the things we're trying very hard is clinical translation. So how does the tooth level correlate to the mom's exposure level? And with some metals, there's a very clear correlation. So for example, we've already done some work looking at blood lead levels in the moms and how that correlates with the dentine levels of lead in the baby teeth. And there's a very tight correlation. So we know that we can see that correlation. And then also, like you said, there might be increased exposure from the bone. But that is some critical work that we're doing to try to translate what we're seeing with the teeth into a clinical impact to understand more about moms and infants' exposure levels and what we can change that would reduce exposure in the tooth. So it's a great question and work that we're still doing to improve clinical translation and impact of this work.
Thank you.
Sí, Rafa.
Hi, Megan. This is Rafa. Thank you very much for your
Rafa.
presentation. Every time I see the dentine biomarkers slides, I get amazed by the work that you do over there. So I think my question would be, right now what you have is all the global measurements for these different MRI techniques. Would you say that the next step would be try to identify specific brain regions that are affected by these exposures?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is work that we're hoping to do some with your dissertation and is to understand. So we looked at these global measures intentionally. One, because we wanted to see sort of overall which modality might be giving us some more information. But we are working with particularly with the work with internalizing and externalizing, we are looking at regions of the brain that have already been identified in the literature as associated with those outcomes and digging a little bit deeper into both cortical and subcortical structures. So yes, absolutely. And I have some data that we could show. One of the main problems that we run into is multiple comparisons. And so the more regions we put, or the more regions we run models, the more we have to control for those comparisons. And we fear losing we already have a small sample size. So we wanted to do the global measures and then very specific hypothesis-driven analyses. So we're working on those now. But it's a great question.
Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Thank you, Dr. Megan. I have a question about the global health and the role of the biomedical engineering. Considering the challenges of global health, how can biomedical engineering contribute to improving access to quality health technologies in resource-limited countries? And what is the key role of the biomedical engineers in this process?
I'm so happy that you asked that question. It's something that I've really been thinking about a lot, particularly in terms of MRI and how critical it is to understanding the mechanisms of what's happening in the brain, both from a structural and functional perspective. And while it is this gold standard, it's hard, right? And it's expensive and it's time consuming, and it's hard to get a child to stay in the scanner. And we know that there are some structural inequalities that are introduced into our research if we only use MRI. And so what I think the main contribution of the MRI work that we're doing is really understanding the fundamentals and the mechanism that can then lead to hopefully less intensive ways of looking at brain structure and function. So we've actually been exploring using things like EEG and FNIRS that could be used more in the field or perhaps in clinical practice, and then looking at associations between the MRI gold standard outcomes and the things like FNIRS and EEG, where we could possibly look at biomarkers of adverse health outcomes, and that since that could be administered or used in the field, it might have more clinical impact because it could be done at a clinical setting or in a field research setting. So I think it could start to improve the reach of some of the work that we're doing. But I hope that answers some of your question, that I think particularly the work that we're doing with the technical precision of the MRI at CI3M allows us to deeply understand the biologic mechanisms underlying these chemical exposures.
Thank you very much, Dr. Megan.
We have one final question. AXA? No? Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. I would like to show you, we are sending you a diploma of appreciation.
Thank you. Gracias.
And we have students from the later years, their final years. So we're trying to encourage them to get into this field of medical imaging and to know that everything we have to do is together with other types of researchers. So thank you very much for your collaboration here in this symposium.
Thank you for the
Gracias.
invitation and the opportunity. Thank you.
Nuestro siguiente invitado es el doctor Roberto Olayo González. Es físico, egresado de la Facultad de Ciencias de la UNAM y obtuvo su maestría y doctorado en la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. Ha realizado estancias de investigación en Minnesota, en Guanajuato, México y la UNAM, en Querétaro. Tiene más de 100 publicaciones, 9 patentes, 1,750 citas a su trabajo. En formación de recursos humanos ha dirigido 14 tesis de doctorado, 23 de maestría, 13 de licenciatura y es profesor titular y miembro nivel 3 del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores. Bienvenido.
¿Cómo quieres? Yo creo que da lo mismo. De todos modos, de aquí me ven y me escuchan. Bueno, pues primero agradecer a los organizadores que me hayan invitado. La plática va a ser un poquito diferente, es muy específica alrededor de ingeniería de tejidos y un poco de biomateriales. Entonces, este tipo de trabajo lo comenzamos nosotros haciendo polimerización por plasma y eso es lo primero que voy a hablar un poco de qué cosa es polimerizar por plasma. Para empezar, qué cosa es el plasma. No es el plasma de la sangre, sino el plasma físicamente. Y después, cómo nos iniciamos, que tuvo que ver con este material puesto en médula espinal. Y eso nos dirigió a diferentes campos de ingeniería de tejidos. ¿Sí? Entonces, primero que nada, normalmente esto lo hacemos hasta el último, pero al último voy a presentar las fotos. Hay un montonal de gente trabajando y yo hablo. Eso es lo más fácil. No, es decir, trabajamos con personas de estas instituciones, la Universidad de la Ciudad de México, la UAM Iztapalapa. De hecho, aquí no están las otras unidades de la UAM, pero trabajamos también con Coajimalpa. Y en Iztapalapa con CBS y CBI, con el Instituto de Neurología, con el INC, con el IMSS y con el Hospital Infantil Federico Gómez. Siempre pongo la lista y seguro se van algunos que también están y no se me olvidaron poner en la lista. ¿Sí? En particular, estos de ellos son, voy a estar mostrando datos, ¿sí? Son estudiantes de doctorado y algunos de ellos ya graduados. Entonces, en ingeniería de tejidos hablamos de 3 zonas, 3 colaboradores: las células, que es el factor fundamental, los suplementos, que pueden ser de todo tipo. Últimamente incluso se habla de suplementos mecánicos, o sea, estímulos mecánicos que van a ayudar a que se desarrolle el tejido, y el soporte de los tejidos, que aquí lo llamamos andamios. Scaffolds es la palabra en inglés, pero es en sí el soporte, todo lo que es en el tejido, la matriz extracelular, es lo que tratamos de poner una matriz extracelular temporal, mientras que el tejido se desarrolla. ¿sí? Entonces, la idea en ingeniería de tejidos básicamente es tomar células del paciente, o sea, vamos a sustituir un órgano, esa es, digamos, la máxima colaboración posible. Vamos a sustituir un órgano, tomamos células del paciente para que no haya rechazo del sistema inmunológico, las cultivamos, las separamos, las ponemos en un andamio, ponemos el andamio de la forma del órgano que queremos sustituir, desarrollamos el órgano y luego ya se lo ponemos al paciente. Eso suena como ciencia ficción, pero esto es un ejemplo de vejiga y eso ya se hace como rutina en los Estados Unidos. ¿Sí? En el caso de México, en el hospital infantil, niños que nacen sin ureta, se les ha diseñado su ureta y después ya crecen con ella. O sea, ya no hay problema con estarle, digamos, anteriormente se usaban algún tipo de prótesis, pero había que cambiarla conforme el niño crece. Entonces, esta solución ya es completa, ¿sí? Nosotros hemos usado polímeros, básicamente, es decir, yo estoy en el área de polímeros, y entonces usamos polímeros biodegradables, fundamentalmente, esto sí se ve, ¿verdad? Sí, polímeros biodegradables, y son todos estos, algunos de ellos son poliácido láctico, policaprolactona, polihidroxibutirato. Los nombres suenan macabros si no están jugando con ellos. Pero, digamos, otro tipo de polímeros importantes son los que están en rojo, que son los que generamos por plasma, polipirrol, polianilina, polialilamina y últimamente policaprolactona también. Y también usamos polímeros naturales, como el quitosano, hidroxiapatita. Hidroxiapatita es un cerámico, elastina, colágena, albúmina, fosfatasa alcalina, ¿sí? Entonces, todo eso es lo que usamos. Entonces, los polímeros por plasma son los principales de nuestra principal contribución. Entonces, es importante saber un poquito del plasma. Cuando tenemos el estado sólido, las moléculas están muy juntas y entonces las interacciones se pueden localizar muy bien. Calentamos el sólido y entonces pasamos al estado líquido. Las moléculas se pueden mover y la física se vuelve complicada, ¿sí? Porque ya no sabe uno quién interactúa, dónde está el que interactúa con entonces se vuelve complicada. Calentamos más y pasamos al gas. El gas es relativamente sencillo porque ahora todo el mundo está lejos y interacciona menos. Y entonces describir el gas es más o menos fácil. Pero si lo calentamos más, ahora las moléculas pierden electrones y entonces tenemos un gas que tiene cargas. Tiene iones cargados positivamente y electrones que están moviéndose. Entonces es muy susceptible a campos eléctricos, ¿sí? O magnéticos para el caso. Entonces, eso es el plasma. Un gas cargado en el total neutro, pero que es muy sensible a campos electromagnéticos. Una de las noticias es que el plasma es lo más común en el universo. 99% del universo es plasma, o sea, son la excepción. Siéntanse en el 1%, ¿sí? De lo que no es plasma, ¿sí? Sin embargo, en la Tierra no es tan fácil ver un plasma. Se ven las auroras boreales, los rayos. Tesla fue uno de los que comenzó a jugar más con el plasma para provocar las descargas y todo lo que hizo. Usamos un Tesla para echar a andar el reactor. Que no es ni un carro ni... ¿Qué más se dijo? Pero bueno, en fin, es un... Ajá, sí. La unidad de campo. Es un Tesla, es un aparatito que echa rayitos directamente, ¿sí? Entonces, el reactor es muy sencillo, se parece a un foco de esos de luz... de luz negra, bueno, no es tan negra, pero bueno, es decir, en estos focos lo que se hace es un poco de vacío, se pone un campo eléctrico, los electrones arrancan y pegan en algunas moléculas que quedaron. Al decaer estas moléculas emiten luz y lo que tienen los focos es una componente que hace que la luz se haga blanca, ¿sí? O sea, normalmente las moléculas se emiten casi siempre en ultravioleta, y entonces la cobertura hace que se vea luz blanca. Lo que hacemos nosotros en estos es poner un campo un poquito más grande y metemos un gas que es susceptible de reaccionar. Y entonces tenemos una reacción en el estado gaseoso que eventualmente se va a la pared, ¿sí? Y entonces tenemos un polímero. Un polímero no es otra cosa más que una unidad fundamental que se repite muchas veces. Entonces, esa unidad fundamental la podemos ver aquí. O sea, este es un pirrol, ¿sí? Se repite muchas veces, entonces normalmente se pone así. Pero en el plasma, como es una lluvia de electrones que activa el monómero es un cachito de ese, entonces tenemos un polímero complejo que no es tan fácil, pero que es interesante porque tiene, digamos, estas X son diferentes posibilidades de interacción química, y entonces es un polímero muy rico en interacción química que nos da muy buenos resultados, ¿sí? Entonces necesitamos hacerlo, digamos, estudiar el infrarrojo para ver qué es lo que estamos obteniendo, ¿sí? Entonces aquí se ve el reactor, estas son las condiciones, y una de las cosas por las que no nos han fusilado tanto es porque nosotros hacemos un polímero de bulto, y eso casi nadie hace. El plasma se usa para hacer cobertura superficial, básicamente. Nosotros hacemos un polímero de bulto. Este polímero lo que hacemos es pulverizarlo con un mortero y después hacer una pastilla. Y entonces lo primero que hicimos, bueno, hicimos varios experimentos físico-químicos con él antes, pero después lo que hicimos fue probar a ver si era biocompatible poniéndolo en la médula espinal de una rata, ¿sí? Se expone la médula espinal, se cortan las hipófisis, se pone directamente el polímero y entonces se cierra todo, ¿sí? Como se partió la médula espinal, el animal queda paralítico porque ya no hay conducción, el polímero no se degrada, entonces queda ahí, ¿sí? Y lo que pasó fue que este es un animal al que no se le puso no se le puso el material, ¿sí? Queda totalmente paralítico, ¿sí? Y este es al que se le puso el material. Entonces comenzó a caminar. Desde entonces somos biomédicos. Dejé de ser físico. Entonces, hemos hecho muchos, no voy a hablar mucho sobre esto porque además también va a haber otra plática de algunos de los participantes. Ahorita trabajamos mucho de lo que hacemos, está haciéndose en el CIM, entonces colaboramos mucho, entonces no voy a decir nada. Por lo pronto es importante que una de las cosas que pasó es que el material se integró a la médula espinal y entonces lo que tenemos primero es que se inhibe el daño secundario, que es uno de los problemas fundamentales de una lesión en médula espinal, y por otro lado el material está haciendo reconexión, ¿sí? Entonces esto es ya de lo último que hemos hecho, usando resonancia. Se puede ver la médula en un mono. Esto es antes de que se le corte la médula. Se puede ver, el del lado izquierdo es el control y el del lado derecho es el que le ponemos el material. Entonces, ahí los dos están iguales. Un mes después, el del lado izquierdo sigue, se va alejando más, mientras que el del lado derecho comienza a tener conexiones directas en la médula espinal. Podemos, afortunadamente yo no les tengo que decir cómo lo hicimos porque ya explicaron lo que hace resonancia magnética y lo que hace tractografía. Pero básicamente comparamos con la histología y estamos obteniendo una recuperación. El animal vuelve a sentir en las piernas lo que está pasando, ¿sí? Entonces, esto es la parte más, digamos, la parte inicial son las lesiones más catastróficas, porque lo que necesitábamos era saber que lo que sea que diera el animal como recuperación era debido a nuestro material, porque se estaba cortando totalmente la médula. Después se hace otro tipo de lesión y se pone el material de otra manera, donde podría ser más fácil que eso pudiera suceder en pacientes. Sin embargo, bueno, aquí hay mucho trabajo con este tipo de lesión, pero lo último que tenemos, que es lo que quiero platicarles, es que, digamos, en todos estos tipos de procesos lo hacemos en la etapa aguda, o sea, se hace la lesión y casi inmediatamente después se pone el material. Sí, de hecho, cuando se hace la sección completa, se tiene que poner el material ahí antes de cerrar. Mientras que acá se lastima al animal y se tiene que esperar 2 días para que baje la hinchazón y entonces ya se puede poner el material. ¿Sí? Pero el problema fundamental de las lesiones de médula espinal, yo no presenté estadísticas, pero son los que ya están lesionados, son los que se están lesionando ahorita. ¿Sí? O sea, no el agudo, sino el crónico, el que ya no puede caminar, el que ya tiene un problema serio. ¿Sí? Entonces, trabajar con el crónico es lo más complicado y entonces eso es lo que estamos haciendo ahorita. ¿Sí? Entonces, tenemos uno que empieza, entonces se hace la cirugía, en el primer día se evalúa para ver que sí está bien lesionado, después en el segundo día sí comienza a dársele rehabilitación, ¿sí? En una caminadora. No, en el segundo día se le pone el material, perdón. En el segundo día se le pone el material, o sea, el primer día 1 se ve si está lesionado, en el segundo día se le pone el material, después en el día 6 comienza a darse rehabilitación y luego se sigue por 8 semanas para ver cómo se está comportando. ¿Sí? Y entonces los otros, ahora se hace la cirugía, se evalúa en el primer día, en el día 6 se comienza la rehabilitación, pero ahora no se le pone el material hasta 2 semanas después. 2 semanas después en una rata implica como 6 meses en un paciente, ¿sí? En un humano. Entonces eso quiere decir que hacerlo en agudo en un paciente nadie nos va a dejar, porque todavía no saben qué tan mal está, quieren saber qué es lo que pasa, pero 6 meses después ya saben qué pasó. ¿Sí? Y entonces se puede evaluar y entonces sí nos van a dejar, bueno, si todo esto se pasa. ¿Sí? Y entonces esto, lo que tenemos aquí es la evaluación de los animales se evalúan con cómo mueven sus articulaciones, ¿sí? Y entonces el movimiento de las articulaciones llega hasta 21, ¿sí? Y aquí lo que podemos ver es que los animales con rehabilitación y con el material después de una semana llegan hasta del orden de 18. Eso es un montón, ¿sí? Y además muy importante porque es, digamos, este es el animal que no el control. Está lesionado, pero sí puede mover un poco, no es como los otros, ¿sí? Y este es el animal después de 8 semanas, a ver, ¿sí? Entonces, prácticamente se recupera un montón de movilidad, ¿sí? Entonces, eso es lo que nos llevó a todo este campo. Entonces, hemos hecho diferentes polímeros, el de mero arriba del rojo es el pirrol, el verde es la polianilamina, ¿sí? Y el otro es la polianilina, ¿sí? La idea fundamental es poner grupos funcionales de aminas en la superficie, porque eso es aparentemente lo que nos da la interacción. Entonces, se ponen en el reactor de plasma, ¿sí? Y se cambian las variables del reactor, se puede cambiar la potencia, ¿sí? Y el tiempo que se deja, ¿sí? Y entonces después se hace un cultivo celular. En este caso se cultivaron células de N1E115 sí, diferenciadas, que son, digamos, muy cercanas a neuronas, y entonces desarrollan neuritas, y entonces vemos cómo se comportan en los diferentes sustractos. Aquí comienza el qué más hacemos, y entonces se hace un análisis de longitud de neuronas para ver, esto se hace con la computadora, para ver en qué potencia se crecen más. Lo que podemos ver muy claramente es que contra el control, que es una superficie de crecimiento normal, que no tiene p-roll, todos desarrollan más largas sus neuritas, y después lo que hacemos es contar cuántas neuritas tiene cada célula, y se divide entre el número de células, y entonces se obtiene el coeficiente de diferenciación, qué tanto se están diferenciando las células, y se puede ver, el control es el negrito primero, con todas las polimerizaciones, sin importar la potencia, todas nos dan mayor número de índice de diferenciación, ¿sí? Entonces, también hemos generado nanopartículas, no son tan nano para los que hacen nanos, o sea, estas son de 200 nanómetros, o sea, son grandecitas, ¿sí? Ahí está el reactor, con infrarrojo volvemos a ver que sí son más o menos, y vemos la distribución, el promedio está como en 320 nanómetros, entonces es una nanopartícula un poco grande, ¿sí? Pero vemos que las nanopartículas se les pegan a las células, en este caso son células beta, y se les pegan a las células, y no solo se les pegan, eso hace que vivan más tiempo en cultivo. Entonces, en particular estas, como son líneas celular, o sea, son células cancerígenas que pueden crecer fácilmente, ¿sí? Entonces, estos son, este es con suero y este es sin suero. El suero tiene muchas proteínas y eso hace que se peguen más las partículas a las células. Pero aunque no tengan suero, el polímero de todos modos se pega a las células. Entonces aquí están, estas son de microscopía electrónica, estas son células solas, pueden ver que son del orden de unos 2-3 micrones las células, y entonces aquí les ponemos las nanos de p-roll. Entonces estas se pegan a las células y las estabilizan, entonces las células comienzan a crecer y al ratito ya crecen y forman un tejido con su propia matriz extracelular. Es decir, se fijan, aquí todavía estamos viendo 1 micrón, pero aquí ya estamos viendo 10 micrones, o sea, la colonia crece ferozmente, ¿sí? Y lo que tengo son tejidos del orden de, es decir, este es 100 micrones, pero está visto de lado, entonces esto es como 300 micrones. O sea, de tener las celulitas de 1 micrón, 2 micrones, ahorita ya tengo 300 micrones y es un tejido que desarrolló su propia matriz extracelular. Entonces, este es un tejido que nos puso muy contentos. Desafortunadamente no es tan exitoso con células de tejido primario porque ya no crecen tanto, ya no proliferan tanto, y entonces ahorita todavía andamos viendo cómo le hacemos. Posiblemente intentar con células troncales, o sea, célula madre, generar el tejido y después diferenciarlo. Entonces, eso es lo que estamos intentando hacer. Por lo pronto, lo que hicimos fue tomar un cultivo primario, o sea, tomar un animal, obtener sus células y ponerles las nanopartículas. Entonces, esto es lo que pasa una semana después de tener un cultivo de cardiomiocitos. Estos son cardiomiocitos. El cardiomiocito es largo, ¿sí? Pero después de una semana se desdiferencia, o sea, se vuelven cuadraditos, o sea, comienzan a desdiferenciarse y a morir, ¿sí? Sin embargo, cuando les ponemos las nanopartículas, duran hasta 3 meses, ¿sí? Y entonces lo que comienzan, o sea, se estabilizan y comienzan a ser agregados. No hacen los tejiditos que nosotros esperábamos, pero estos agregados están generando su propia matriz extracelular. Entonces, lo que esperamos hacer con esto es poner los cardiomiocitos con las nanopartículas y tenemos dos ideas. Una es, de hecho, en terapia celular se inyectan las células madre directamente al corazón y se trata de que la distensión del infarto llegue en células y lo refuercen, ¿sí? La otra posibilidad es generar parches. Entonces, ahí estamos pensando en imprimir parches, o sea, imprimir geles con células estabilizadas con las nanopartículas y entonces poner los parches en el corazón, ¿sí? Entonces, en esas andamos. Entonces, para generar los andamios, o sea, necesitamos usamos los polímeros, pero lo que necesitamos es una malla, algo que sea poroso y que tenga mucha superficie. La manera de poner algo con mucha superficie, pues, es hacer nano cosas. Una fibra que tenga un diámetro nanométrico va a exponer mucha superficie, ¿sí? Porque es muy fácil, piensen en un cubito de 1 centímetro, lo parten en 4, aumenta la superficie y el volumen es el mismo. Ahora lo parten 1.000.000 de veces, entonces tienen una nanopartícula y la superficie es del orden de una cancha de fútbol. O sea, la superficie aumenta ferozmente cuando yo tengo nanocosas. Entonces, aquí generamos nanofibras, esto se genera así y se ve como una telita, ¿sí? Pero cuando las vemos al microscopio electrónico, son fibras que tienen huecos y que pueden sostener perfectamente una célula, ¿sí? Las recubrimos, los polímeros que estamos usando son biodegradables, pero no tienen muy buena interacción celular. Entonces las recubrimos con el reactor de plasma y entonces, en este caso, fue para ponerlas en cartílago y les pusimos también proteínas en la superficie, ¿sí? Vemos cuál es la distribución aquí usamos 2 polímeros, policaprolactón y poliácido láctico. Vemos cuál es la distribución de diámetros y la distribución de huecos. Es decir, por medio de la computadora nos aseguramos de que haya suficientes huecos para que las células puedan crecer tridimensionalmente, ¿sí? Y entonces ya se probaron in vitro y se pusieron subcutáneos en un animal. La pregunta es, ¿por qué subcutáneos? O sea, ¿quién va a tener un cartílago así pegado en la espalda? Pues nadie. Pero es muy importante el experimento, porque una cosa es crecerlo in vitro, donde nosotros controlamos todas las variables, la temperatura, los gases, etcétera, y otra es ponerlo ya en un ser vivo. Para empezar, una de las cosas que aprendimos es que cuando no les gusta el polímero, el sistema inmune lo ataca y lo desbarata, ¿sí? Entonces, cuando menos, esa es una de las pruebas iniciales, que es que el sistema inmune no los va a atacar. Y después es que obtenemos un tejido, ¿sí? Y podemos probar que ese tejido es de cartílago, ¿sí? Bueno, por lo pronto lo que hicimos es los tejidos después de esto fue 2 meses, ¿sí? Los probamos y les hacemos pruebas mecánicas. Es decir, el que no tiene agrecano alcanza una deformación del 100%, mientras que el que tiene agrecano se mantiene y alcanza una deformación del 200%. Eso suena como poquito, pero es un montón de deformación extra, ¿sí? Y vemos qué es lo que pasa con el que tiene agrecano, forma células redonditas y estas son células cartilaginosas, mientras que el que no tiene el agrecano también forma cartílago, pero es un cartílago fibrilar que no es tan eficiente como el cartílago normal. Se prueba con inmunohistoquímica, esto es con proteínas que pintan, que interactúan con diferentes proteínas. O sea, sabemos si hay colágenos, si hay agrecanos y vemos cómo están los núcleos. Entonces, estamos seguros de que lo que estamos generando es un tejido cartilaginoso, ¿sí? Entonces, todo esto es primero y después ya vamos a la rodilla. ¿Sí? En la rodilla se estirpa un pedazo de cartílago y se pone el material. ¿Sí? Se cierra, se deja por un buen rato. Estos conejos son conejos, se quedaron por un buen rato, o sea, estuvieron por 9 meses, les tocó pandemia, entonces no podíamos trabajar, entonces estuvieron por 9 meses y cuando tuvimos las rodillas pues, se veían igual que las de un animal sano, no se notaba dónde había estado el andamio, qué es lo que pasaba. Entonces les hicimos pruebas mecánicas, este es el equipo con el que se hace pruebas mecánicas y este es el cartílago sano y este es el cartílago reconstruido, ¿sí? No es igual, es decir, tenemos ya, ahora sí ya sin pandemia, mucho tiempo para intentar, es decir, para ver cuál es el problema para que no nos dé la misma prueba, pero el comportamiento general es bastante bueno, ¿sí? Y estos son los números, créanme que no vamos a aprender mucho si se los discuto, pero lo que es importante es, este es un cartílago sano, y entonces tenemos, digamos, en la parte del hueso, el cartílago calcificado, el cartílago, digamos, auricular, y ya la parte senovial. Entonces, estos son los nuevos tejidos, y tienen... Es decir, lo importante es que déjenme ver, si aquí está. O sea, tiene todos los elementos del cartílago sano, ¿sí? Que es el que hicimos con agrecano, ¿sí? Y los que no tienen agrecano nos dan un cartílago fibrilar, pero también nos dan cartílago, ¿sí? Entonces, ahora lo que necesitamos es tener, es decir, pues más pacientes. O sea, aumentar el número no es trivial, tener muchos conejitos y buscar tener el máximo de evaluación. ¿Sí? Uno de los problemas, digamos, algo que sí vimos es que en cartílago, como los atletas se lesionan mucho, ¿sí? Y entonces hay un montón de posibilidades y nada los deja así como los vemos nosotros. A vista, el nuestro está jalando muchísimo mejor, pero es a vista nada más. Necesitamos demostrar más cosas, ¿sí? Entonces, en el caso de hueso, ¿sí? Aquí lo que tenemos es, partimos, o sea, parte del proceso de hueso es que el hueso sí se reproduce. Y entonces cuando uno se fractura, pues nada más hay que inmovilizar y dejar aquí. Y el hueso se reproduce directamente. El problema es cuando tienes un tumor y te cortan un cacho de hueso suficientemente grande, ¿sí? Y entonces ya no va a poder regenerarse todo ese hueso. En particular, es decir, la solución hasta ahorita pues es una prótesis. O sea, pones metal y tratas de sustituir el hueso que ya no está. Sin embargo, en niños eso es muy complicado, ¿sí? Porque sí tienen tumor, el hospital infantil se puede ver, tienen tumores y entonces les tienen que poner una prótesis, no hay de otra ahorita, ¿sí? Pero los están interviniendo cada 6 meses porque está creciendo y entonces a veces tienen una prótesis que tiene una tuerca que se va moviendo, pero en general es muy invasivo el problema con los niños. Entonces lo que necesitamos es un hueso que vaya creciendo, pero para empezar necesitamos un hueso que cubra un espacio suficiente, entonces necesitamos muchas células para hacer crecer el andamio. Entonces la única manera es partir de células troncales y establecerlas como osteoblastos y eventualmente llegar a osteocitos, etcétera. Entonces, esto es lo que hicimos aquí, partiendo de células troncales de médula espinal, es decir, se aislaron las que necesitábamos para ponerlas. Enseguida hicimos un andamio que esta vez está además, es decir, necesitamos que sea más duro, porque eventualmente pues, con el hueso no puede ser nada más el polímero. Entonces le pusimos además algo que es muy común, muy parte del hueso, que es hidroxiapatita, es un fosfato, ¿sí? Entonces, este es un andamio ahora podemos ver que la hidroxiapatita es bastante más grande, más gorda que los cachos de láctico, ¿sí? De nuevo vemos que hay suficiente espacio entre el andamio para que puedan crecer las células, ¿sí? También podemos ver, además de infrarrojo, podemos ver Raman, y el Raman nos permite ver la distribución de la hidroxiapatita. El cerámico no está uniformemente distribuido en el andamio, entonces podemos distinguir que se nos acumuló en algún lado. Eso eventualmente, pues lo que queremos es ver si va a ser eficiente con el hueso, ¿sí? Entonces, el infrarrojo de todos modos nos da que, es decir, primero vemos la hidroxiapatita y el siguiente es ya con pirrol, ¿sí? Hacemos el experimento in vitro, ¿sí? Y después lo hacemos otra vez subcutáneo para ver que no pasa nada. Entonces, este es el experimento cuando no tenemos mucha hidroxiapatita, ¿sí? Y entonces el hueso se vuelve un poco, es decir, aquí no queremos que el hueso se haga como liga, o sea, que se estire, y eso está pasando en este cacho, ¿sí? O sea, todavía no se hace un hueso sólido, ¿sí? Mientras que cuando tiene suficiente hidroxiapatita, entonces sí se rompe directamente. Es decir, se está haciendo un hueso más sólido. De todos modos, estos son 2 meses, todavía no es el tiempo de probarlo, y entonces este era el subcutáneo. Ahora lo que sigue es poner este mismo andamio en un barreno. O sea, se hace un barreno en cadera y se pone ahí, y entonces nosotros ponemos muy poquitas células de todos modos. Entonces, lo que tiene que pasar es que ahí sí el hueso migre, pero migre al andamio, y le ofrecemos que tenga un andamio, o sea, un sostén para que pueda rellenar un espacio suficientemente amplio, ¿sí? En general, es decir, nada más tengo 1 hora, entonces hay muchos tipos celulares con los que estamos trabajando: osteocitos, hepatocitos, células beta para páncreas, fibroblastos, queratinocitos para piel, embrionarias de riñón, que lo usamos también en piel, estelares, que hacemos combinaciones con hepatocitos para ver si podíamos configurar un poco algo más parecido al hígado. Sin embargo, ahí lo que nos está pasando es que las estelares, cuando nada más son 2 tipos celulares, se vuelven epiteliales. Entonces se diferencian. De todos modos, sí encontramos que los hepatocitos producían mayor albúmina. Las últimas son Sertoli y Lidberg, y Leydig, y Sertoli, que son células testiculares que producen la testosterona. Entonces, eso está muy bonito, porque lo que hicimos ahí fue con diferentes andamios para ver cuáles tenían mayor reclutamiento celular, y cuáles se mantenían las células funcionales. Lo que se encontró es que solo el que tenía polipirrol y un copolímero de láctico con glicólico es el que se funciona, y esto es muy importante porque ahí sí, como parches celulares, son muy útiles, porque la testosterona llegó a la sangre inmediatamente. A los 2 días ya la testosterona estaba en la sangre de un conejo castrado, así es que se pueden poner parches hormonales, y eso podía ser muy interesante, ¿sí? Olvídense de la menopausia. Digamos también, sin yodo lo hemos probado neuronas, mioblastos, hepatocitos. Es decir, algunas son líneas celulares, no cultivos primarios, ¿sí? Y entonces esto es en general. Fui a una plática de un científico japonés y presentó a su grupo, y eran como 250. Entonces nosotros no tenemos tantos. Estos son los colaboradores en el hospital infantil, ¿sí? Estos son los colaboradores en el grupo de médula, ¿sí? y estos son los colaboradores en la UAM. Sí, entonces, muchas gracias. Gracias. Va a ser mi colección de panteras.
Sí, y le agradecemos su participación. ¿Tienen algunas preguntas? Sí.
Ok, la parte de secreción sí se revisa porque las tienen que ordeñar inmediatamente y eso dejan de hacerlo. Sí, entonces esa parte sí se ha observado, no se ha estudiado sistemáticamente. Actualmente estamos con otro experimento donde se afecta el nervio ventral, es el último. Y ahí sí están haciendo estudios de secreción muy cuidadosos, ¿sí? Pero obviamente sí se recuperan, se recuperan, al menos las de secreción se recuperan, ¿sí? Y ya más no hemos explorado. Sí. Es conejos la mayoría, sí.
¿Cómo hacen la lesión en la rodilla del conejo?
Sí, o sea, lo que se vio en las fotos, lo que pasa es que no me gusta mantener mucho rato las fotos porque ya me han criticado mucho por eso. O sea, que estoy haciendo sufrir a los animales. O sea, se expone quirúrgicamente la rodilla y se corta directamente el cartílago. Y entonces, ahí se pone el parchecito digamos, de andamio, ¿sí? Y se vuelve a cerrar. Y desaparece o sea, cuando ves la rodilla no se ve dónde se puso, o sea, se integra totalmente, pero eso es a la vista, ¿sí? En la histología pues hay diferentes, ya no es la mismo tipo celular, sino que hay en algunos de los andamios es fibrilar, ¿sí? Pero el que es completo prácticamente, es decir, ya sería muy complicado ver, ahora sí necesitaríamos ver todo el tipo celular y la matriz extracelular, que es una parte importante en cartílago, ¿sí? Porque necesitas tener igual elastina, igual colágena, etcétera, ¿sí? Entonces, para que nos dé las mismas propiedades mecánicas. Lo que sabemos es que da propiedades mecánicas semejantes, pero no iguales.
Yo no más quiero preguntar más sobre eso. Entonces, les falta evaluar la parte funcional, digamos, ya.
O sea, es decir, en el caso de cartílago, o sea, ya funciona. O sea, nos falta ver que es una función totalmente equivalente. O sea, sí, o sea, digamos, perdón, es conejo. Ajá, exacto. De hecho, no se quejaron, no es cierto. Es decir, como duró mucho el experimento, ¿sí? O sea, si no es por las marcas que tenían, o sea, no hubieran sabido cuál era, nos anduvieron correteando.
Todos estos protocolos que están corriendo, ¿cuál diría usted que es el más próximo a hacer ya un estudio clínico?
Yo digo que al que se le ha puesto más trabajo en esa dirección es al de médula, ¿sí? O sea, es decir, el problema para llegar a estudios clínicos es la regulación, tener laboratorios con buenas prácticas, y dinero. O sea, entonces, eso es lo que ha sido más escaso. O sea, digamos, en un momento dado, por ejemplo, se podía pagar porque un laboratorio ya certificado haga las pruebas, ¿sí? Pero eso nadie nos lo dio, ¿sí? Entonces ahorita estamos bajo, digamos, esquemas que lo que van a buscar es que pongamos una compañía para nosotros mismos comenzar a producir.
La mayoría de la información que nos mostró acerca...
Perdón, no te escuché.
La mayoría de la información que nos proporcionan acerca de las circulaciones en médula espinal están relacionadas con la capacidad motora de las ratas. Mi pregunta es, ¿han realizado estudios para ver la capacidad de transmisión de información a través del andamio? Nunca me he dicho.
Ajá, ok. Digamos, se tienen estudios de potenciales evocados. Sí, no son triviales, entonces, digamos, se sigue trabajando en ello. O sea, esa es una de las cosas fundamentales. Y fuera de eso, en lo que hemos invertido bastante tiempo es en la histología, o sea, en ver que haya neuronas allí, que se establezcan neuronas y por lo tanto que haya comunicación. Digamos, lo más cercano a lo que tú dices, que haya la conducción, es decir, se ha hecho con lo motoro y con potenciales evocados, no hay resultados tan espectaculares como lo tenemos con la parte motora.
Sí, una más.
Bueno, en el caso de médula y de hueso, queda claro, digamos, el problema que ataca, pero en el de cartílago, ¿en qué situaciones de los humanos se vería eso como de que se recorta y se recorta?
Todos los jugadores de fútbol.
Pero,
todos los tenistas, sí.
Todos los tenistas. O sea, a ver. No, o sea, a ver, evidentemente lo que nosotros queremos es tener un andamio que con muy pocas células reproduzca el cartílago, ¿sí? Y entonces, digamos, lo podemos hacer en fémur, o sea, digamos, eso se hace, en las prótesis se hace con polietileno, ¿sí? Digamos, después puede ser cartílago más fuerte para columna vertebral. O sea, en términos generales, ahorita lo que queremos es ver que podemos, que podemos reproducir condrocitos en condiciones muy, muy específicas. De hecho, el caso de rodilla se vuelve interesante porque se vuelve pues, un bioreactor. O sea, porque todavía cuando lo pones, pues es una malla polimérica, ¿sí? Con poquitas células. Y entonces cuando lo estirpas o lo ves para la histología, ves que lo que tienes ya es un crecimiento celular importante, ¿sí? Tienes matriz extracelular y puedes identificar, también eso no lo presenté, pero puedes identificar que tiene agreganos, que tiene elastina y que tiene colágena, ¿sí? Entonces, digamos, está creciendo el cartílago. Después vienen cosas un poco más complicadas, ¿sí? ¿Cómo podrías ponerlo sin ser tan invasivo? ¿Sí? Porque lo que va a pasar siempre es, o sea, es más fácil cortar y tratar de poner y luego ver qué pasa, ¿sí? Eso te dice que lo que estás haciendo funciona, pero lo que sigue es sanar y eso, digamos, como tanto en médula como en el cartílago, lo que necesitas es ver cómo dejas tu andamio, ¿sí? En alguien que está enfermo, invadiendo lo menos que puedas, ¿sí? Entonces, digamos, inclusive, es decir, podríamos tratar pastas, o sea, porque en cartílagos ya se usa mucho la operación laparoscópica, o sea, nada más te metes y dejas ahí. Entonces, digamos, hay desde posibilidades como los lentes intraoculares, que es un rollito y que después lo estiras ahí y tienes una lente, ¿sí? Como lo que sea que pongas va a crecer, ¿sí? Entonces puede ser muy chiquito y lo puedes poner laparoscópicamente.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias. Nos estamos viendo. Vayan a los talleres. Hoy hay un taller de inteligencia artificial y uno que es muy importante para mis alumnos de seminario de proyectos, que es cómo escribir cuentos de terror, ¿sí? ¿Por qué? Pues ya saben que hay que escribir un protocolo y se van a dar cuenta que es parecido, ¿Sí? Bueno, gracias.
Ok, chicos, entonces recuerden, asistan a los talleres y también pasen aquí los equipos de Entre para que ustedes los vean tantito y los prueben, por favor.